So in this video, I'd like to talk to you about UVs inside of Zbrush. Now, UV coordinates are a way of taking a 2D texture and then wrapping it around a 3D object. If you think about a football or a soccer ball and think about how if you were to cut apart that pattern that makes up a soccer ball, you could flatten it out so it's a sphere that can be flattened. The same is true of UVs. UVs look at your three-dimensional object. They look at each individual polygon and they look for ways to cut along these edges so the object can be laid out flat, sort of like putting together a pattern for a garment. It's a three-dimensional object that's been cut so it can lay out flat. And if you can lay it out flat, you can paint a two-dimensional texture that then wraps around the object. Now, to generate UVs inside of ZBrush, we need to step down to our lowest subdivision level and go to Tool, UV Map. Now, if I morph UV on this character, there's actually a UV set that's already on this model that was created outside of ZBrush in Maya. But I want to talk to you about how to create UVs directly inside of ZBrush. So if you look here, we can set our map resolution to begin with. I'll set it to 4K. You can adjust your map border, and that's the overpaint border so you don't get seams. Usually leaving it at 4 is fine. Now here we're able to create UVs. The first few, UV cylindrical, UV spherical, UV planar, UV box, and UV box tiles, these are all for primitives. And if you're dealing with that type of object, it'll be very apparent that you want to use those UVs. The ones that we're most concerned with are AUV, GUV, and PUV tiles. These are the quickest automated one-button press way of creating UVs in ZBrush. If I press AUV tiles and then morph UV, what ZBrush has done here is it's taken each individual face and assigned it some texture space, and it's taking up the full 4K image space, so it's extremely efficient. However, it's not human readable, and that's not really desirable because if you've got an error in your map that you need to paint out in Photoshop, you'll never be able to find it. These aren't really suitable for most pipeline applications because we need to be able to open up a texture map and read it as a human eye. GUV tiles is another one. This is grouped UV tiles where things are grouped by their level of detail. Again, not human readable. Now I have used these when I wanted to get UVs out in a hurry for a personal project or a quick render. But as a general rule, I wouldn't use them because UV Master is so efficient, so fast, and it produces human readable UVs. So let's take a look at that now. I'm going to go back up to the Z plugin menu, tear that off on the side of the screen, and you'll find UV Master right here. Now the first thing that I want to do is I want to click Work on Clone. That's going to copy the model, and it's going to delete the subdivision level. So I'm working on a single subdivision level of this mesh. Here's my original model there. It's still there, but this is the copy, the clone that's been created by UV Master. Now I'm going to unwrap the mesh. So I'm going to click Unwrap, and this is going to give me just the base unwrapping. I have check seams turned on so I can see where the seams are. If I click Flatten, it will flatten out the pelt, and I can see this is not a really good UV. It's not clear what's what, and the seams are running through the worst possible area, the center of the face. So how do we stop it from doing that? All right, what we're going to do is we're going to enable control painting. I'm going to turn off polygroups for the moment, and I'm going to turn on protect. Now here I've got a control painting that's already on the model. The red area is being protected from getting seams. The blue area is saying, ZBrush, try and put your seams here. So let's take a look at how we do this. I'll go to RGB. I'm going to select Color, Fill Object. Color, Fill Object, and it'll clear that control painting. Now I'll go back to red. So if I've got Protect selected, I'm going to be painting red. I'm going to paint red all over the face. Let's go back to our dot stroke with no alpha. So we get a nice clean painting here. I'm just going to paint red all through the face and ears. Now I'm going to click Attract, and Attract is going to paint blue. And blue is going to attract the seam. So I'm going to attract seams to here. Let's go back to Protect, and let's go ahead and try and protect these sides of the head as well. So basically I'm saying, hey ZBrush, do me a favor and give me a seam that runs down the back of the head. So I'm going to click Unwrap again, and there you go. We get a seam that runs right down the back of the head. If we were to flatten this now, you see we get a much nicer pelt. It's very clear what's what. It's very easy to read. So if I want to get these UVs onto my model, I simply click Copy UVs, come back over to my original mesh and paste UVs. And now if I go to the UV map menu, I can click Morph UV, and it will show me that it has applied those UV coordinates. Now there's a couple other things in the control painting I want to talk to you about. If I enable control painting again, we can turn on density. And if I take density and I do ×2, areas that I paint with this sort of lime green are going to get twice as much texture density. If I do ½ and then paint the back of the head, areas that are painted with this blue are going to get half the texture density. Now if I unwrap again and then flatten, you'll see the effect that this has. It gives us more texture density for the face and less texture density for the rest of the head. Now generally this is not something that I use. I like my UVs to be quite uniform and just increase my map resolution. But I think it is important to know that this is available. You can also attract from ambient occlusion, so this will automatically paint your model with attract seams based on where the shadows are. So that's actually quite useful. Ambient occlusion, of course, is going to be darkest where areas are occluded. So it's a nice place to hide your seams. So if you have a successful control map and that you want to save it, you can always save your control map here. Just click that button and it'll ask you to save your control maps. Now also, you can unwrap all, and if you unwrap all, it will unwrap all your subtools, but I actually prefer to do them one at a time. So now let's take a look at a different model. We've opened up our alien, which has poly painting on here. And if I go into frame mode, you see that I've actually got polygroups set up, a different polygroup for each antenna and a different polygroup for each ear, and then a polygroup for the head and torso. This is going to allow us to use the polygroups option here under UV Master. So what I'll do is I will go back and click Work on Clone. That will once again clone the mesh, and I'm going to enable control painting, go to Protect, make sure that my brush is set to RGB, and let's go ahead and paint red into the face. And I'm not too worried about getting it on the ears because we've already told Zbrush that anywhere that I have a polygroup, it's going to create a separate UV island, so it's already going to cut a seam around the ear. That's just kind of a given at this point. Now I'm going to switch to Attract, and I'm going to paint an Attract stripe down the back of the head. Go back to Protect, and let's just try and protect these shoulders. Now I am going to go to Attract, turn my brush size down real low, and I'm going to run a stripe up the back of the antenna. I want Zbrush to try its best to put its seams up the back of the antenna. Now that's our control painting. I'm going to click Unwrap, and here we go. Right out of the gate, perfect seam down the back of the head, seams up the back of the antenna, and a seam running around the ear with the seam going up the back of the ear tips. So I could not ask for better placement. So now I'm going to click Copy UVs. Go back to our head and make sure that we step down to our lowest subdivision level, and I will paste UVs. Now if we go down here to UV map, we can morph UV and then see what we get. Oops, I accidentally double clicked it. There we go. And we'll turn on solo so we don't have the subtools. There we have the islands for our ears, the islands for the antenna, and the head. So this is a really nice UV to work from. Incidentally, it is possible now to paint in this view. There's a whole separate video where I talk about adjusting poly paint as well as painting in Morph UV mode, so I'd recommend checking that out. So here we've got our UVs established. What this means now, I'm going to Morph UV back. We're able to extract maps. That means that I can take all of my poly paint here and I can bake that down into a texture map which can live outside of Zbrush. I can take that to Maya or 3D Studio Max. This model can now be animated and rendered in a pipeline. It also means that I'm able to share this with people that are working outside of ZBrush. For example, if I have a Z tool that has poly painting, um, you're only going to be able to see that poly painting either inside of ZBrush or in um, Keyshot. Keyshot does render ZBrush poly paint. However, if I wanted to take my model and put it up as an OBJ with a texture map, anyone with any 3D application can then take that model, open it, and then render it with my texture maps and my displacement maps. So being able to create UVs and then extract maps is very, very important for portability, for getting your work outside of ZBrush. Now, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. I think UV Master is an incredible tool. It is an automated UV mapping solution, but as you saw, it is just miles above all the other automated solutions that predate it inside of ZBrush, those being the AUV tiles and, let's go to create, the AUV tiles and GUV tiles, which are not human readable. This gives you a human readable UV result. It takes an enormous amount of user input, but it still automates the process of unwrapping UVs. And you can really get in there and have a whole lot of control if you take advantage of the fact that anytime you have polygroups and you turn on the polygroup button here, ZBrush will create separate UV islands from those regions. You may also want to note that if you have control painting turned on, oops, I have to go back to my clone. If you have control painting turned on, you can also attract your seams via ambient occlusion. I find this works nicely for more abstract shapes or hard surface shapes. What this does is it places your seams in areas that are occluded by shadow. So anywhere the ambient occlusion is darkest is obviously going to be a more recessed and hidden area. And this is actually kind of a nice way to take a more complicated object and attract your UV seams into those regions. So be aware that that option is also available. So that completes our look at UV Master and UVs inside of ZBrush. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Now, as we said in the chapter on UV layout, if you want to get your work out of ZBrush, you have to have UV coordinates and you have to extract maps. So your geometry, you can export quite simply. You just step down to your lowest subdivision level and then go to export, and you can export an OBJ file. Texture maps, displacement maps, etc., those require a couple more steps. To get all your sculpting and painting out of ZBrush, your painting you're going to export as a texture map. So we'll step up to our highest subdivision level and we'll begin with that. How do I get this poly paint out of ZBrush? Now remember, this model has UV coordinates assigned to it. If I go to UV map and morph UV, you'll see that we actually have a pretty clean UV layout that was created with UV Master. Let's solo that and focus so we can see it. So that's a pretty nice clean UV layout. So I'm going to turn off morph UV, turn solo back off. I want to get this poly paint baked down into that UV map as a texture map. So to do so, I'm going to go to texture map, and here we have a submenu called create. If I click create, I can select new from poly paint. So if I click new from poly paint, it's going to generate this texture, but it's set it to 1K. That's 1024 by 1024, which we don't want. So I'm going to go back to UV map and set my resolution to 4K. Go to texture map and create new from poly paint. And now we'll get a 4K map. So here I've got my map sitting in the texture slot under the tool menu. If I save my Z tool at this point, it'll save that texture map with it. But I want to be able to export this map. And to do that, I click clone texture, and that clones it out of this texture swatch and places it in the main texture palette here. And from here, I'm able to click export, and then I can save it as a PSD file. You could also save as a JPEG, a PNG, or a TIFF file. So that's all you need to do to get a texture map out. It's actually quite simple. Next, let's talk about a normal map. Normal mapping will be familiar to those of you that are very interested in real time, like gaming. Normal mapping is a way to represent all the sculptural detail of your model without having to have an extremely high resolution mesh. If we go to the subtool menu and turn off poly paint on the head here, and go to our texture map and turn off the texture, we can actually see the sculptural detail in this character, and there's quite a bit of little fine details on there. A normal map is going to capture those details, and then when you render it in Maya or in your game engine, it will create the illusion of there being a very, very detailed surface. The only thing that a normal map cannot do is it cannot change the overall silhouette of your model. So you need to make sure that the model, the lowest resolution, is built in such a way that the perimeter, the silhouette, looks good. It doesn't look too faceted, because a normal map is only going to create the illusion of detail here in the detail of the head, not the perimeter, because it doesn't actually change the geometry. So let's look at how we create a normal map. I step down to my lowest subdivision level and I go to the normal map menu here. I'll leave it at tangent. I can turn on adaptive. This just changes the methodology by which the map is created. Sometimes adaptive will give you artifacts, sometimes turning it off gets rid of them. Usually I turn it on. The only reason to turn it off, I think, is if it's taking too long or if it just doesn't work accurately. Smooth UV will smooth the UV border, and smooth normals smooths the edge normals. So it's quite simple. You do have the option to flip the RG and B channels. Now this is going to be entirely dependent on where you're rendering the map. If you're doing it in Maya, these settings are fine. But in some game engines, you might need to change this, so there will be a technical person who can tell you if these need to be changed. So I will click now Create Normal Map. And what it's going to do, it's going to process the adaptive rays. It's basically ray casting from the center of the model, and those rays will intersect with either the high resolution mesh or the low resolution mesh. Whatever one it intersects with first, it makes a note of that value, and then it eventually hits the other mesh. So it's going to record for each pixel the difference between the high res and the low res model. That's why sometimes normal maps and displacement maps are called difference maps. Essentially, these millions and millions of rays are calculating for each pixel on the surface of the model whether or not that point needs to be pushed in or pushed out. So it'll just take a couple more moments before it's finished generating that map. And there we go. Your normal map is applied here in this texture swatch. So you can see we've got a nice sort of relief map there. Now, again, if I want to export this manually, I click Clone Normal Map, and that places it in the texture menu here. And from here, I can export that map. Now, let's take a look at displacement mapping. I'm going to open up displacement map, and I'm going to set it to DP subpix 2, smooth UV, flip V, because typically the Maya texture space is flipped vertically from Zbrush, so we need to flip it. And I'll set 3 channels. Now you can set it to 32-bit, but we'll talk more about that in a moment when we do the multi-map exporter. This defaults to a 16-bit map. We do set it to 3 channels, even though it's shades of black and white. The 3 channels gives us more bit depth. 32-bit will bake in the object scale and give us a super accurate map, but that's more useful to us when we're using the Z plugin multi-map exporter. So we'll talk about that there. So now I've got 2 buttons. I can create the displacement map here, or I can create and export the map. If I click that, it's going to ask me where it wants to save the map, and then I can tell it where to save and then create the map. Now typically I select DP subpix 2. If this gives you artifacts or it doesn't work well, I'll set this down to 0 and I'll turn on adaptive. I have found that adaptive mode tends to take longer, so usually I go to DP subpix 2. And what this is, adaptive mode, when it's generating the displacement map, it will adaptively subdivide the areas with more detail to give you a super crisp map. But it's working just in those areas that have high detail. DP subpix is sort of a global setting, so that will subdivide the model 2 more times in memory to give you a very high frequency, high quality map. So once we've got those set, I will click Create Displacement Map. And once again, it will cast rays. It's going to cast rays from the origin out, hitting the shell of the model. If it hits the low resolution first, if it hits the first subdivision level first, because imagine that in ZBrush right now, it's got the highest subdivision level and the lowest subdivision level sitting on top of each other in space. If it hits the low res first and then it hits the high res second, it knows that it has to record a lighter value there because the mesh is pushing out. If it hits the high res first and then hits the low res, it's going to put a dark value in there because that means that the high res is pushing in from where the original model is. So here's our displacement map. And once again, we'll click Clone Displacement. It places it in the Alpha menu, and from here, we can export it. Now, what's kind of nice is you'll notice that this displacement map is actually displaying as a bump map on the surface, so we can actually get a clear picture of how it's going to look. It's a nice way of troubleshooting or just testing to make sure that all the detail is in there, because we're still on the lowest subdivision level right now, but there's all the detail in my map. Now, if we want to preview our mesh displacement as actual displacement, you can turn on the mode button here, and that shows it as an actual displaced mesh. If I turn it off, it's simply displaying it as a bump map on the lowest subdivision level. So we've seen now how to do normal maps and displacement maps, and how to do texture maps. Now, if I have a texture map in the texture map slot, I have a displacement map in the displacement map slot, and I have a normal map in the normal map slot, I could take advantage of GoZ. What GoZ will do is, if I click GoZ, or click All, or click Visible, it will take all the subtools, or the visible subtools, whichever one I press, and it will automatically export them and load them up in a GoZ compatible application. So what I have on my system is Maya. So if I click Visible, it will take this mesh, export it out as an OBJ. It will export each map that I have loaded up into one of these swatches. So it'll export the texture map, it will export the displacement map, and it will export the normal map, and it will automatically set up the shader in Maya so those are ready to render. And all you need to do is press GoZ, All, or Visible to make that work. Now, the first time you run it, it will ask you to browse to a path for a GoZ enabled application. So you can check the Pixelogic website for which ones are being supported. I know it's Cinema 4D, Modo, Maya, 3D Studio Max. All the major 3D applications seem to be supported by GoZ. So let's go ahead and press the Visible button, and that will export the visible subtools to Maya, and then set it up with the normal map and the color map. So I'll press that now, and then I'll return when we are in Maya. So here Maya has loaded, and it's automatically imported the OBJ file and the associated textures, and then set up the shader network to represent those textures. So as I move around the object here, you'll see that the normal map is displaying on the object. We've got all of our detail visible here. That's because we're using Viewport 2.0 and hardware texturing. So if you turn those on, you'll see that Maya actually automatically creates a shader network for you that figures in your normal map as well as your displacement map. It also has the color map automatically set up. So these are all very, very handy, and it's a nice way to just streamline getting from Zbrush into Maya. So that is GoZ, which you're going to find right here. And that's going to work for all the major 3D applications. You'll just need the first time that you run it to browse to the path of the application that you want to be using. So now that we've seen how to manually create each map, I'd like to talk to you about a plugin that is extremely useful that allows us to do several things that we cannot do when we're just extracting maps using the displacement map and the normal map options here. And that's called Multimap Exporter. I'm going to go to the Z plugin menu. We'll tear it off to the side of the screen, and I'll go to Multimap Exporter here. And here you see that we've got a selection of map types that can be selected. So I'm going to turn on displacement, normal, texture from polypaint, ambient occlusion, cavity, and export mesh. Now, vector displacement maps are created in ZBrush. They allow you to displace around angles. So instead of just displacing in or out, vector allows you to go around 90-degree angles and spirals. If you open Vector Displacement Map here under the Tool menu, you have the option to run the diagnostic. What you need to do is run the diagnostic, and that creates a file for you that you will then have to test in your own renderer. So vector displacement maps don't have a sort of standardized setting yet. So each renderer will handle them a little bit differently. So to determine what your settings need to be, you need to run this diagnostic and then render the resulting file in your 3D application. And then that will give you the settings that you need for vector displacement map. So we're going to focus in on the other map types: standard displacement, normal, texture from polypaint, ambient occlusion, cavity, and then exporting the mesh. So I can turn on subtools, and this will allow me to export all my maps for all my visible subtools. Now, if my subtools all have UVs that sit within the same UV region, I can turn on merge maps, and that will merge all the subtool displacements into a single map, and that can be really, really useful. For example, if I'm working on a costume where the shirt and the pants, the UVs for both of them occupy 0 to 1 texture space, I can turn on merge maps, and then I can just extract both of those maps from each subtool and then merge them together automatically. We can set our map size here. Right now it defaults to 2K, but you can set it all the way up to 8K. I'm going to set it to 4K. There we go. We have these preset buttons here that you can press to speed up selection. Map border is the overpaint border. I just leave that at 4. Flip V, of course, flips vertically, and recalculating the smooth UVs. If you're getting arrows along the seams, if you recalculate your smooth UVs at the highest subdivision level, that can help if you're getting artifacts along the seams. Now we open up render options. File name. This allows us to change the type of naming that we have for each one of our displacement maps. Now, Multi-Map Exporter has one very huge benefit over extracting your maps into the tool menu, and that is that it will work with UDIMs. It will work with models that have UVs outside of 0 to 1 texture space. So if you are working with UDIMs, it is possible to extract your displacements using Multi-Map Exporter. Also, if you've got a model that is using UDIMs, you can use HD geometry levels, and Zbrush will extract your color and your displacement using those multiple UDIMs, and it will figure in the HD geometry subdivision levels. So it's an actual really nice way of getting around the limitation of a single UDIM in Zbrush and some polygon count limitations. You can subdivide up to 1 billion polygons with Geometry HD. If you watch the HD geometry video, you'll see that in action. And then if you have the UVs for your base model spread out across multiple UDIMs, you can take full advantage of all that texture resolution, because 1 billion polygons is not going to create a particularly good displacement map in 4K. So you really do want to have a model that's taking advantage of UDIMs, and you need to extract using Multi-Map Exporter if you want to get displacement or color or any other maps outside of the standard 1001 or 0 to 1 texture space. Next we have Switch MT. Now if you have imported a model to sculpt on, the process of sculpting on it is going to change the level 1 subdivision shape. Switch MT allows us to store a morph target of the model before we start sculpting on it, and then Switch MT, if you turn that on, it will switch back to that original shape before it generates the displacements. So to show you what I mean by that, if I were to bring in a polysphere, and let's say that this polysphere is somewhere being set up in Maya for rendering, and it's been passed to me, and they say, would you sculpt something on this that we can displace? So I add subdivision levels and I do some sculpting here, and I say, okay, well, here we go. Step down to the lowest subdivision level and generate the displacement map. Well, the problem is this displacement map is going to be applied to this polysphere. Now you can see that level 1 is completely different. The shape of level 1 is completely different between these two levels. So what I need to do is step down to level 1, store a morph target, add some subdivision levels, do my sculpting, then step back down to my lowest subdivision level, and then switch the morph target. That's what this button does, switch MT. That means that it's going to generate a displacement map between this shape and then the shape at the highest subdivision level. So the values are going to be accurate to displace this form from this base model. So that's very, very important, because if you don't switch back to your original morph target and you try and apply those displacements to a slightly perturbed mesh, your displacement values are not going to be accurate. So keep that in mind. If you don't remember to store a morph target, you can always just import your level 1 OBJ back into level 1 and then generate your displacements. Because as long as you don't step back up your subdivision levels, it's not going to change the sculpture at the higher subdivision levels. So step down to level 1, re-import your original mesh, and then generate your maps. Estimate time and reset all settings. Estimate time is not really particularly accurate in my experience, and reset all settings will reset your settings to the default. Now we have the settings per map. So if I go to displacement map, I can set what subdivision level I extract my map from. Now that can be handy because if I were to extract my displacement, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the displacement map here, and I'm going to go to texture map and turn that off. Go to polypaint and turn polypaint back on. So if I extract a displacement map from here, the difference between level 1 and level 5 is vast. That's a displacement map. However, if I step down 2 subdivision levels and I extract a map from between level 3 and level 5, that's mostly high frequency detail. So if I extract a displacement map from level 3, that's going to be more like a bump map. It's not going to carry so much of the big shapes. It's going to carry more of the fine detail. So it can be desirable sometimes to change your subdivision level from which you extract the map. Again, I'll set DP subpix to 2, turn off adaptive, smooth UV, 3 channels. Now, when you're using a 16-bit map, which is what this is, it doesn't have object scale baked in. Your look dev artist, or you, if you're the one rendering, you're going to have to adjust your alpha gain to get your displacement settings correct. If we set it to 32-bit and then turn the midpoint down to black, that's going to create a 32-bit displacement map. And I often turn on EXR because that's typically what I'm using at work. This will create a 32-bit map, 32-bit displacement map centered on black rather than gray. Now what this means is the look dev artist can bring that displacement in and it will render perfectly on the first go. They don't have to tweak any of the volume settings or the intensity settings on the map to get an accurate displacement. Scale and intensity, and I leave these as they are, and I usually don't mess with my 16-bit scale. So those are my settings for displacement. We'll leave those as they are. Close out displacement, and then we'll open up normal map. Normal map again, tangent adaptive, smooth UV, smooth normals. The rest of these buttons, you will know if you need to change them because someone will tell you, or it will be in the documentation for whatever your renderer is. For Maya, these settings should be fine. Ambient occlusion map. This is going to pull the ambient occlusion settings from the masking menu. So if I go to Tool, Masking, Mask by Ambient Occlusion, I can adjust these settings here, or I can adjust them here. Now Cavity Map will also pull its settings from Mask by Cavity. So here, if I want to create a cavity map, I turn up my intensity, and then I make the curve look something like this. Then I click Mask by Cavity, and this gives me a really nice mask that just gets down into all the recesses. It creates a nice black and white mask that will be quite useful when you're look deving if you want to be able to mask out the recesses or the high points. A cavity mask allows you to do that. Cavity map will just create that mask as a map. So cavity blur, cavity intensity are here. You can use the same curve for all the subtools if you're going to be generating displacements from multiple subtools at the same time. You can make it a 16-bit map, and you can use colors. You can use the main and secondary colors when you're creating the map by clicking here, and that'll utilize these colors. Now mesh export just gives you the settings for exporting your mesh. We want it set to tries, and we want groups turned on. That'll export the polygroups with the mesh. We also turn on merge. That merges your UVs when you export the mesh. And we can also set the subdivision level that is exported. Now if I want to save these presets to share with other artists, I can save them using this button here. Now when I'm ready to generate my maps, I simply click Create All Maps, and it will generate each one of these maps and save them in the location that I specify. So if I click Create All Maps, it's going to ask me where to store them. I can browse to a location to store them. Let's go to our project files, and we'll create a new folder here, and we'll call it Map Exports. And I'll click Save. And it will go through and it will generate each one of those maps, as well as exporting the geometry. Now when it is completed extracting the maps, it'll give you this message here telling you that all maps have been created and exported. to the folder that you selected when you clicked Export All Maps, Create All Maps. So that completes this lesson on how to generate maps inside of ZBrush. We've seen how to create them manually under the tool palette, going in and just directly creating displacement, texture map, and normal map. We've also seen how to use the multi-map exporter, which also will generate maps in UDIMs and UV space outside 0 to 1. So if you do have your UVs spread out across multiple UDIMs, then this is definitely the way to go. And the multi-map exporter works fantastic in conjunction with HD geometry. If you have HD subdivision levels and a mesh with UDIMs, you can take full advantage of all that resolution that's available to you here by spreading it out across multiple maps. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next. In this video, we're going to take a look at fiber mesh, which is a method of creating simulated hair and fur, as well as grass and other types of fibrous objects inside of ZBrush. We access fiber mesh under the tool Fiber Mesh menu. And if we open up Lightbox Fibers, you'll see that there's an entire set of different presets that are available here. This is actually a great way to learn fiber mesh, is to load up a preset and then look at the modifiers to understand how it was created. What I'm going to do for this demonstration is place a beard on this ogre model. Now, I don't treat fiber mesh by creating just a single big hair object for my fiber. I don't mask out an area. Fiber mesh is based on masking. You'll grow hair out from where you've masked the mesh. I don't mask out the entire area and then grow one hair object from that. I treat this the same way I would treat creating a wig or laying on a fake beard on someone if you were doing makeup. You actually lay hair on layer by layer. And fiber mesh works best, I find, if you treat it the same way. Create the layers of hair in multiple fiber mesh objects that then lay on top of each other. Then you have more control and more ability to adjust. So let's take a look at how that works. We're going to begin just by placing a mask here on the chin. This is going to be the first portion of our beard. Now the areas that are masked out, this is where the hair is going to grow. I'm going to Control-click to feather the mask because I want the hair to be thinner along the edges of this one hair object. Now I'll open up Lightbox Fibers, and I'm going to open up Fibers 160. This is a really great preset I find to work with to start. So now obviously this is too long and too thick. So what I'll do is I'll open up my modifiers. I will go down here to length, and let's dial the length down considerably. There we go. Now there's too much hair. I'm going to turn down the max fibers. I want this beard to just be a little bit scragglier. So let's turn these down. And let's turn our coverage down. There we go. Now here I have the option to do my by mask or by area. I'm going to turn up by mask, and that's going to force the fibers to grow based on the masked area, which is what will thin it along the edges of that feathered mask. Now it's a little hard to see what's happening here, so I'm going to go to Document, and let's go to Back, and let's grab a nice light gray, something like that. There we go. Now it's a little bit easier to see that hair. Now the hair is sticking out straight, and we don't want that. So what we need to do is increase the number of segments we have so gravity can affect it more effectively. Turn up our segments, and you see the hair starts to droop. Now we can control gravity here. If I want the hair to stand straight out, then I would just orient the model like this, and then adjust my gravity, and then the hair, oops, there we go, will stick straight out in reaction to that gravity slider. So let's actually fix that. We don't want the beard to stick straight out like that. We want it to fall down like this. Now, when I'm happy with this, I can do a BPR render just to see what it will look like. We haven't accepted these settings yet. This is still a preview. This is not a fiber mesh object. So after we render, there you can see, well, let's move that a little bit so we can see it better. And let's render it here. There we go. Now you can see the hair that we will get. And I'm pretty happy with that shape, so I'm going to click Accept. And now if I go to Subtool, you see we have a Fiber Mesh subtool. So I'm going to go back to the head, select that, and then I'm going to clear my mask. Now I'm going to create a second mask object, or masked area, for our next bit of fiber mesh. I'm just going to do a little triangular bit right here at the sides of the chin. And I want to make sure that this mask overlaps the previous fiber mesh object. Okay, orient that, and then go back to fiber mesh. Now it's going to remember my settings, so if I turn on preview, this works quite nicely. It's picking up the same settings. I might just adjust my length here and just make it a little bit shorter as it comes up the sides of the face. Then if I'm happy with that, once again, I'll do a BPR render. Something I find helpful too is hiding my mask when I'm doing this render. It just helps me see the hair against the skin. The mask will still be there. I just go to the masking menu and turn off View Mask. So there we go. Let's go to Masking and turn off View Mask. So the mask is still there. I'm also going to go to the Render menu, and I'm going to go to BPR Shadow, turn up Angle, and turn up my rays just so I get a better shadow. And there we go. Let's render that again, and you'll see it's a lot easier to see the resulting hair. There we go. So let's go back to Fiber Mesh and click Accept. And now we will have a second Fiber Mesh subtool. So let's go back to the head, and we'll continue laying up our beard section by section. Once again, I'm going to overlap the previous fiber mesh, and I'm just going to bring this up along the sides of the mouth like this. I'm going to turn off my X symmetry. I just want to make sure that this sits exactly where I want it to. Make sure that I remove the previous mask, otherwise I'm going to end up doubling up on my fiber meshing. But I definitely want this to overlap the previous fiber mesh just slightly. That helps those two blend together. Let's go to fiber mesh again, and we will preview. Now what I'm going to do is I want these to stick out just a little bit more, so I'm going to turn gravity down, and that's going to give it a little bit more spring, so it's coming out from the sides of the face just a little bit. Let's turn that down even more, and you'll see what I mean. Oh, that's a bit too much. There we go. And I might increase my coverage just a little bit here, so it's a little bit thicker as it's coming up the sides of the face. Now once again, I will test my render. Let's go to the masking menu. Turn off View Mask, and then do a render. And there we go. I feel like I could actually increase the coverage a little bit. I think I might have dialed it back too much. So I'm going to go back to Fiber Mesh, and let's increase max fibers, and then do another test render. And there we go. So I'm pretty happy with that, so I'll click Accept. Let's say yes to fast preview mode. And then we're going to go ahead and Alt-click on the head again to select it, and let's put in our mask for the next section. I'm going to turn my X symmetry back on, and just make sure that this section of mustache overlaps the previous. And let's preview. Let's give it a little bit more thickness there. Feather that mask by control-clicking on it, and then preview once again. And let's give that a quick render. Now we're going to use the move brushes and the grooming brushes to just sort of adjust things as we go. The shape of the hair doesn't have to be what we see right here. We can actually do some more tweaks on it once we're finished laying up the various layers of our fiber mesh objects. And there we go. I'm pretty happy with that. It's a very stylish goatee for our dapper ogre. Let's accept that. Okay. Now I'm going to go back to the head, clear my mask, and now let's go to our subtools and let's grab that last fiber mesh object there. We'll turn on X symmetry, and now I'm going to take the move brush. And my favorite thing to do is just sort of adjust the flow of the hair, adjust the positioning of it using the move brush. It's pretty easy. I can take the smooth brush as well, smooth things back, and then shift them around just using move. And that can be pretty helpful to make sure things are sitting where I want them to. Now let's go to our next fiber mesh down. You'll see that's this portion here. What I can do is I can adjust these like so. I can also go to B for brush, G for groom, and one of my favorite groom brushes is Groom Turbulence. It just sort of adds irregularities to the hair. So I can do this, just add some turbulence to that, some kind of variations. There we go. And I'll take the move brush and just brute force adjust the positioning of things. The roots will stay in place. It just allows me to move the hairs, the fibers themselves, and just force them to flow in the direction that I want them to flow. And we'll adjust this one as well. There we go. Now I'm just going to go ahead and do a quick render to see the goatee. Now fiber mesh will export to Keyshot, but it's not going to be renderable outside of Keyshot or Zbrush. You can export these fibers as actual polygon objects. You can also export them as curves to drive hair simulations in other programs. I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. Mostly fiber mesh is used for rendering in Zbrush and in Keyshot though. There we go. So you see we get a nice beard here. We're able to go in and adjust it layer by layer, which gives us a lot more control than if this were just one big hair object. If I wanted to export this, I could go back here to fiber mesh, make sure that I have a fiber mesh object selected. Now I can click export curves, and what this will do is it will export the fibers as curves, and those curves can be used in other hair simulators as guide curves. We also have the ability to adjust our BPR settings. We can adjust the anisotropic on the root and the tip. We can also adjust the subdivision smoothness and the number of sides and the radius. We can also export a vector displacement map for these. Vector displacement maps will displace, unlike normal displacement maps, they displace around curves. So this is actually quite an interesting option that you might use, especially if you're using fiber mesh to create grass or vegetable objects, things like that. A vector displacement map can be quite handy for that. Usually, though, we're exporting curves or we're just rendering it in Keyshot. So let's take a look now at putting a little something on the top of the head. Let's give the, let's put a little top knot of hair here. And what I'll do is I'll orient the hair like this. I'll go to preview. We'll just use the same previews, but I'm going to turn my length up. And let's turn gravity up so it falls back a little bit more. We'll turn up max fibers. Turn up our gravity. That's pretty good. Let me make it a little bit longer. All right, and I'm going to accept that. There we go. So now I have a new fiber mesh object here. And what I will do is I will go to B for brush, G for groom, grab my groom turbulence brush, make sure that I'm on that particular fiber mesh object. And the groom turbulence brush, like I said, is just one of my favorites. It creates a nice kind of chaotic sort of natural feeling turbulence to the hair, I guess is the best way of putting it. I'm just going to hit this with smooth and move, just to move this hair down and make sure that it's not laying over the ear. We're giving him quite a hip haircut here. There we go. Oops. Zoom back in. And then I'm just going to use the move brush to adjust these. And then I can go back to my groom. Now we have the ability to do, there's groom hair long, there's groomer strong. The groomer strong is just a much, much stronger groom brush. So it basically forces the hair to follow the direction that I brush it in. So I can brush it over like this, brush it over like this, and then come over here to the side view, brush it down, give that a little bit of smooth, and then go back to groom turbulence to break that up a little bit and make it feel a little bit more irregular and natural. And then I'll do final tweaks using the move brush because it's getting stuck to the ear there. I'll just take those, move that, come around to the back here and move that. It's a very silly haircut for an ogre, but looks like he's hanging out at the local dive bar, has a band, plays a ukulele. Here we go. Let's get this little piece right there. Perfect. All right, now I just want to hit that with smooth just to get rid of that. All right, oops, undo that. That one's really bugging me. Let me get you. There we go. Bring that down. Now we'll do a BPR render and we'll see the resulting hair. Now there's an awful lot of fibers on this one, so it's going to take longer than that beard took. And there we go. So you see we get a really nice natural feeling hairline there and some nice turbulence and sort of variation along the length of that hair. I mean, I would take the move brush and probably try and fix this little calic right here. Just knock that down. And then we'll just go ahead and select the head again, alt click on the head, and we'll add, let's clear the mask, and let's add another little bit of hair right here. As I said, we would lay out our hair in sections, so I would do the back of the head separately as well. So let's go ahead and bring this up. Go to Fiber Mesh, Preview. Oops, I had X Symmetry turned on, so let's turn off X Symmetry and let's clear that mask on that side because we don't want the hair coming out of that side as well. Preview, turn our length down. And that's pretty good, I think. So let's go ahead and accept that. Let's go to the head, clear the mask, go to our subtools and go back to our fiber mesh object. And I'm just going to begin by doing a little bit of smooth and move. Make sure that this lays around the ear here. Bring this down against the scalp a little bit more. And let's go to our groom strong. Let's turn off solo. Take our move brush, pull this out a bit, pull that out a little bit. And let's get that hair so it's growing from that part. Let's give it a little bit of a curve there. Bring out a little bit of volume here. And again, we want to make sure that it's not sort of interpenetrating the mesh. So we'll pull a little bit of a sideburn down here and then scooch that in. And then we just want to take this little bit here and make sure that it's laying against the head. And maybe go to groom turbulence and just give it a little bit of variation. Just hitting it with the turbulence brush just creates a real nice variation. And there we go. Very silly hairstyle for a for an ogre, but you know, maybe he's sort of changing his style. You know, I'm not gonna judge him. If he likes it, he likes it. There we go. Adjust that just a little bit, and BPR render. And there we go. So you can see basically it's a matter of placing a mask for the region where you want to grow the hair from, previewing your hair preset, and then adjusting things like the length, the coverage, the max fibers, and potentially gravity to get the effect that you're looking for. Then you accept it and it becomes a fiber mesh object, which you can then adjust by using the move brush, smooth brush, and grooming brushes. So hopefully this has been an informative introduction to fiber mesh. Once again, I think one of the best ways to really dive into the tool is to explore the presets and see how each type of shape has been created. And then you can go in and tweak those settings and then further explore how you can make the types of shapes that you want to make. Because fiber mesh can be used for not only hair, but grass and leaves and ivy, all sorts of fibrous kind of extensions or flocks of objects. So hopefully you found this video useful, and I will see you in the next one. Let's take a look now at how we can render turntables and other videos directly out of Zbrush. So I want to do a turntable of this orc that's set up with a bust. So it's a little potentially a collectible, maybe for 3D print. And I want to do a turntable so I can show this off. So the first thing I want to do is I want to set my document resolution to the resolution I want my video to be. So I'll go to Document, I'll turn off Constrain Proportion, and I'll set it to 1920 by 1080. That would be HD. Resize, say yes, and then Control N to clear the canvas. We'll zoom out the document, and then I'm just going to draw my character back on screen, zoom him out, and then get him nicely oriented in the center of the screen. Now, to do movies, we go to the movie menu here. We'll tear it off to the side of the screen, and we have the option to do the document or the window. I always select document because that gives me just the document window. If I do window, it's going to give me the full ZBrush interface. We have 3 options for size. I do large, which is 100% of my document resolution, which I set to HD. Now, I have the option to do a turntable here. If I go to my modifiers, here I can find the modifiers for the turntable. I can set my spin frame. It's going to be the y-axis, which is fine because we're looking straight down the z-axis. We want him to rotate around the y-axis. The number of frames, 180 frames for one cycle. And we're just going to do one cycle because, of course, we can loop the video. Now, we want to actually do the render itself. That's very, very simple. We simply press turntable. So I'm going to go ahead and press turntable. And you see what happens is it starts writing out the individual frames of the turntable. Until it is complete. Now I'm going to go to Overlay Image. I'm going to turn Overlay Image Opacity down to 0. And I'm going to turn the Title Image Opacity Fade In and Fade Out down to 0. If you have a title image or an overlay watermark, you can put them in there, but generally I leave those empty. Now, if I go to Movie and click Play, I can see my turntable. If I want to export this, I turn on High Quality and click Export, and we can export it as an MPG. Now, this is just the default renderer. This is not the prettiest render that we can do. So let's do this. Let's click Actual Size so we can get close up to the character, and I'm going to do a BPR render. So there's a nice BPR render. I'm going to go to my material settings, and I'm going to go to wax modifiers, and let's turn the wax modifier up. And then I'm going to go to render. Under render properties, I'm going to turn on wax preview, so that gives me some translucency to the skin. Now under render BPR shadow, I'm going to turn angle up, and I'm going to turn my raise up. Now let's do that render again, and you'll see that we get a much nicer look to our shadows and to our skin. There we go. We get a nice soft shadow, and it's much more appealing. Let's go to the light menu and let's take the secondary light here. And we've got that set behind the object. If you click on that light, it brings it to the front. If you click on it again, it brings it to the back. And let's just put a little bit of color in that. Let's make it a cooler light, just like so. And we can turn up the intensity on a little bit. Go to our key light. That's set to 1, and that's just fine. I might make it a little more dramatic by bringing the light up here. Then I'll go to my material settings and I'll go to modifiers, and I want to change my specular. So I'm going to open the specular curve and I'm going to broaden it, and I'm going to turn my specular component down. There we go, so it's not quite so plasticky. Now let's do our render again. I'm going to come back up here to my movie frames and I'm going to delete the frames that are still sitting in memory. I'm going to do a BPR render. Now it's going to take a little bit of time to do that render. And there's the effect that we get. Now watch this. If I go to the render menu and I turn down the strength of my shadows and then render again, if the shadows are too strong, I can actually dial them back a little bit. I can also go to render properties, and I can turn on ambient occlusion. Now if I render again, you'll see I will get the addition of ambient occlusion shadows on here, but that is going to increase the render time. There we go. So let's do a turntable that's using this renderer. So leaving it in this rendered view, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to click turntable again. Now what ZBrush will do is it's going to calculate each frame and render each frame before it writes it out. So we're going to get a much higher quality turntable now because each frame will be rendered using the BPR renderer. So I'm going to pause this recording because this is actually going to take a bit of time to render. I'm going to pause and then come back after this turntable is complete. So the render has now completed. If we go to the movie menu and click play movie, now we can see our full turntable with the high quality render. And again, if we want to export that, we just click make sure high quality is checked, click export, and then we export it as an MPEG. Now, I can save my movie. If I click Save As, it'll save it as a ZMV file. A ZMV file is a ZMovie file format. So I could open those frames up again later and then export it at any point. Or add to this, if I were to render another movie at this point, it would actually append those frames onto the end of that turntable. So let's take a look now at another type of movie that we can record. I'm going to switch over to this version of this alien bust. Now, this version of the alien bust actually has undo history attached to it. So if I go back to my regular standard brush, you can see my undo history right here. If I come all the way back to the beginning, let's turn on solo so we're just looking at the head itself. If I come all the way back to my first undo, it's going to take a moment to load that. There we go. We're at undo history state 1. There we go. 1 out of 2,685. This is the sphere that I started that bust from. Now, if I want to append the next movie onto the end of the last movie, I would just go ahead and render it. But I don't want to, so I'm going to click delete to delete those frames. I don't want to save that. So now, instead of doing a turntable, I'm going to do a forward history. So this will record the entire sculpting process by stepping through my undo history. So I'm going to make sure that I'm on document, large, and again, our document resolution is still set to HD. So I'm going to click F history. And what it's going to do, it's going to load through a smooth camera transition rotating around the sphere while I sculpt it into that alien head. Now, it's actually quite interesting that ZBrush is able to determine what angle I was looking at the model from at each movement, and then moves the camera to match the view that I took as I was sculpting. So you're always at an optimal view for the changes that are being made, and then it smoothly transitions between each one of those. And this is a great way to sort of share training or share a process if you just want to do a speed sculpt and put it up on ZBrush Central. This is a great way to do that. So obviously this is going to take a bit of time. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this video and let this record, and then we'll come back and take a look at the resulting film. So that history film has finished recording now. So if we go to movie, play movie, we can see it play back in real time. So it's quite fast and fluid in the playback, and it shows your entire sculpting process from beginning to end. Everything that's in your undo history will play back in this video. So to exit out of this recording, we're just going to go ahead and hit escape rather than watch the whole thing play back. So I hope you've enjoyed this look at the movie options in ZBrush, and going forward now you can create your own turntables and histories and share those and be able to feature that aspect of your work. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. So let's take a look at how we can use Decimation Master to create 3D objects that can be 3D printed to make physical objects of what we've made in ZBrush. We're going to begin by using this troll here. Now this is 5 subdivision levels. He has 2 million polygons and poly painting. Now while it is possible to 3D print poly paint, oftentimes we just don't do it, but it is possible to retain your poly paint when you do your decimation. Now what is decimation? Decimation takes a mesh such as this, which is millions of polygons, millions of little squares, and it tessellates it. Now if you watch the video on Sculptor's Pro Mode, you'll understand that tessellation is the triangulation of the mesh. Decimation Master looks for areas of extremely high detail, and it makes smaller triangles in that area. Then it looks for areas of low detail and makes bigger triangles. Now what that means is we no longer have subdivision levels, but we have a mesh that maintains the look of being very highly detailed, but does not have as much geometry. So it effectively makes the model more efficient and easier to 3D print. So let's take a look at how we'll do this. We'll go to Z Plugin, tear this menu off on the side of the screen, and open up Decimation Master. Now the first thing we need to do is pre-process our mesh. So we're going to click Pre-Process Current. You can pre-process all, which will do every subtool, but I prefer to independently decimate each subtool so I can make sure that they come out at the level I want them to. So I'm going to click Pre-Process Current while I'm selecting the head. It will analyze the mesh, and then what it'll do is it will create a cache file on disk. You'll see it writing out here a cache file. Now, if as you're working with Decimation Master, if it starts to behave strangely, if the decimation doesn't work, or it does some unusual behaviors, then what you'll want to do is come down here and click Delete Caches, because after you've made a few caches, sometimes they can get corrupted. Not often, but if your Decimation Master starts to behave strangely, delete your caches and then redo your pre-process. So now we have pre-processed the mesh. It is reordering. And now it's writing that cache file to disk. There we go. Now it is complete. Now we're able to go in here and actually set our decimation. Now I have the ability to keep my UVs or use and keep polypaint. And polypaint weight will determine how much of the polypaint is actually impacting the decimation process. Now you need to have this turned on before you do your decimation for it to work. So for example here, if I set my decimation level to 800,000 polygons, I use this slider here, 800,000 polygons. If I click Decimate Current, there you go. You see that it decimates, but it does not retain that polypaint. So if I undo that, and then pre-process again, but this time have use and keep polypaint turned on, you'll see what happens is we're able to actually maintain our polypaint. There we go. Now we have pre-processed it with polypaint turned on. So now if I come down here and set my thousands of polygons to 800, this is the slider that I always use for decimation. I don't use percentages and I don't use thousands of points. I use thousands of polys. This is set in thousands, so 800 is 800,000 polys. I click Decimate Current, and because we set it to use and keep polypaint, it maintains the color. If we go into frame mode, you can see what it's done is it has triangulated the mesh. Areas with high detail get smaller triangles, but if we look at the back of the head, we get much larger triangles because there's not as much detail back here. That is the crux of decimation. It basically triangulates the mesh and then reduces triangles in areas that don't have detail and keeps them in areas that do. So now we've reduced this down to a much lower polygon count. It is much, much easier for us to 3D print this. So I'm going to do a little bit of adjustments to this now and clean it up and make it a nice 3D printable base, 3D printable object with a base. I want to slice off the torso and make it more like a bust, so I'm going to go to the Clip Curve brushes, click OK, turn on X Symmetry, and let's just go ahead and actually, what we'll do before we do that, let's go to the Trim Curve. Now what Trim Curve actually does is it slices the geometry off physically. So I'm going to turn off my X Symmetry, and I'm just going to make some big slices here. I want to get rid of the bottom part here. I want to get rid of this part here and get rid of this part here. There we go. Now it's going to be easier for me to use the Clip Curve. So I'll go to my Clip Curve, turn on my X Symmetry, and now I'm going to create a nice clipping plane right through here. And that should mirror very nicely and give us a very pleasant looking bust. Now, I'm going to do a rotation. I'm going to turn on the pizza boxes, so I rotate all of my subtools, and I just want to adjust the position of the character in space. And I also want to do a little slice down the back here, so we don't have so much thickness here. So what I'll do is I'll do my, my trim brush again. Let's do Trim Curve. Control Shift Click and Drag, and I'm just going to create a nice swoop right up through here, just so it's a little bit more graceful. We should slice that off, and now it's a much more graceful appearance. Now if I go into frame mode, you can see I've got a nice polygroup for this area here. I can Control Shift Click on that to isolate it. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to fill this area with at least a variation of the base color if I'm going to be printing this with color. Like I said, some 3D printers will actually print in color. So I'll just go to my standard brush. We don't need to use an alpha, and we'll leave it on the dot stroke. Make sure we're on RGB. And now I can very, very easily use this polygroup just to isolate that area and then fill that with color. And then I'm just going to do the same thing for the sides here. I just don't want that overspray. It looks a bit strange. So we just want to clean that up a little bit. Bring that color right up to the edge. I'm going to turn my RGB intensity down so it feathers it out a little bit. And then we'll run it right up to the edge. And of course we want to do it on the base as well. Now most of the time we're not printing in color. It's not very many printers that print in color, and there's not a lot of demand to print in color, to be honest. Usually these things are printed on gray resin and then painted by hand. But I did want to illustrate for you how you could maintain your color. So now the bust, the head itself, has been decimated. If we go to the eyes, here we have the eyes, and those are only 50,000 polygons, and the teeth, those are 245. So let's go ahead and decimate these. I'll select the eyes, and once again, we'll keep our poly paint, and we need to pre-process current. So I'll pre-process the eyes. That is complete. So let's see, these are set to 50,000, so let's set this to, let's set it to 0.5, decimate current. That's too low. Let's set that to 2. Decimate current. Still just a little too low. Let's set it to 4. Decimate current. And that's good, especially if you consider the scale that this will be printed at. If we zoom right in, we might see faceting there, but if this is only going to be printed at about this size on what you see on screen, then those facets are not going to be apparent on the eyes. We'll switch to the teeth now, and we'll do the same. Let's turn visibility back on the eyes, and again, we pre-process current for the teeth. And let's set this to 4,000. Decimate current. And there we go. We have a nice decimation on those teeth. We get the detail. Oh, actually, no, I'm going to undo that. I'm going to set this to 7. Decimate current. That's better. So now we've got all of our subtools decimated. Now I'd like to add a base on here. I'm going to append a poly star. We'll select that poly star, and then let's just move this, turn off our pizza boxes, move this down, and then let's turn this into a cylinder 3D. Let's scale this up. I'm going to go to Deformation, Unify. There he is, right up there. That's the problem. My pivot is down here, but the object is up there. So let's unlock it, go to the Unmask Center, lock it again, and then bring it down. There we go. Thought something was amiss. Hold down the Shift key and I'll snap rotate that 90 degrees, scale it down, and then scale it up a little bit so we have a nice little base here. And I'll scooch it back a little bit so it offsets the weight at the back and it doesn't take up too much real estate at the front. If we go into frame mode, you can see that it's all one polygroup. So I will go to the polygroup menu and click Group by Normals, and that'll give me a different polygroup for each normal. Now I can go to Geometry, Crease, and then Control, click and drag Bevel Width, and I can get a nice little bevel on the edges of that, just like so. Now I'm going to go to B for Brush, Z for Z Modeler, click OK. And then what I'll do is I'm just going to zoom in here. And if you haven't seen the Z Modeler video yet, I encourage you to go watch it. If I click and drag, I can insert edges here just to sharpen these edges when I add a subdivision level. So I want to keep these bevels quite sharp. So I'm going to do this. Now I'm going to Control D and add subdivision levels, and you see it keeps that nice bevel there. All right. Let's go ahead and fill this with a nice color. So I'll do RGB, color, fill object. There we go. So now my object is ready to be 3D printed. Well, not quite. We need to set a scale, and we need to export it in a file format that can be opened by the print bureau, or you can upload to a website that does 3D printing like shapeways.com, for example. So what we want to do is we want to export this as either an OBJ or we want to export it as an STL. Typically STL files seem to be the most common. It's sort of a standard file format for manufacturing, whereas OBJ is a standard file format in visual effects and games. So how do we do that? We go back to our plugin menu and go to 3D Print Exporter, or 3D Print Hub, I should say. Now here we can import an STL file. We can set our size and we can export. So first I want to set our size. So we can do this in inches or in millimeters. Let's say I want this to be 6 inches tall. We click that. So this means that the object, when it's exported, will export 6 inches tall. If we come down here to size options, we can do this for all subtools. So everything will actually scale to that scale, keeping its ratio. So let's go ahead and export to STL. So I've got export options down here. I'm going to export all, and I don't want to export separate files, so I'm going to turn that off. If I do that, it'll export a separate file for each subtool. I just want them all together. All right, now I can set it to binary or ASCII, just like an OBJ file, just like a Maya file. They can be either ASCII or binary. Binary is a bit smaller. ASCII is larger and human readable. That's really the only difference. Usually I just use binary. So I'm going to go ahead and click Export to STL, and we're going to go ahead and save this, and we'll call it Troll for print. Now that exports everyone at the selected scale. Now I want to check and make sure that that is exported correctly. So I'll go to a polymesh star and I'll come back here and I'll click import STL file, and I'll import that same file. So that's the STL that I just exported, and there we go. Now you'll notice this did not maintain the RGB values. So what I need to do is go back over here, and under my export settings I'm going to turn on textures, and I'm going to export again, export to STL. Save, and then let's let it finish. Let's go back to our polymesh star. We'll go to our import options, turn off skip color, and then import STL. And there we go. We bring it in with the color. So this ensures that everything is exported correctly, it's all decimated nicely, and it's a single object and it's watertight. So this will be 3D printable. I can take this STL and go to a 3D print bureau and ask them to print it, or I can go to a website where I can upload this STL and in real time see the pricing. Shapeways does that. I use them a lot. I can upload an object and it'll give me the pricing for different materials and tell me if there's any potential problems with the mesh. Which brings me to the other mention. If you have not yet, watch the video that I have recorded on polypaint from thickness and draft angles, because that is very, very helpful when you're doing 3D printing, because it will allow you to see areas that might be too thin that may cause a problem with your 3D printing at whatever scale you happen to be printing at. So that is a new tool within ZBrush 2020, and I recommend that you go check that video out now. So that is 3D printing and decimation. I hope you found this video useful, and you can go forward now and start preparing your own models for 3D print, because there's nothing quite like holding an object in your hand that you created in 3D. I make a lot of jewelry and fine art myself using ZBrush, and it's so amazing after years and years of working in materials that don't have a degree of permanence. Digital isn't permanent. Foam latex and resins, those aren't necessarily permanent, but seeing your object in metal or bronze, that's really special. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next. Let's talk now about posing our characters in ZBrush. Now, we've seen posing used on just a single subtool, but what happens when we have multiple subtools, as is the case with this cave dweller creature? Here we have teeth and a tongue, and we have a floor plane here which I've hidden, which I just used as a guide when I was trying to make sure that the fingertips and toes were sitting on the same plane. Now I can delete that floor plane, I don't need to keep it, but that still leaves us with 3 separate subtools. Now I want to pose those tools together so they follow and the teeth don't get left behind when I pose my character. Now to do that, we're going to use a plugin under the Z plugin menu, and that plugin is called Transpose Master. Now when you open Transpose Master, it will look like this. What we'll do is we'll click T-Pose Mesh, and what that does is it takes all the subtools and steps them down to their lowest subdivision level, bakes them together, and creates a temporary model here called the T-Pose Mesh. And that T-Pose Mesh has all the subtools in it. Each one has a separate polygroup, and they're all set up so you can pose them together. So let's take a look at how we'll do that now. I'm going to use transpose for my posing. Now what that means is I'm going to come up here and go to rotate, R for rotate, but I'm going to turn off the gizmo, and that gives us this transpose line. Now when I'm in transpose mode, that is the gizmo is turned off, if I control, click, and drag, I can do what's called transpose masking, which masks based on the underlying topology. So I'm going to begin just by masking the torso. And I'm going to go into draw mode, and I'm going to turn on my X symmetry. I'm just going to do a little bit of masking here, just to extend that mask down. Invert and then control click to feather the mask. Now I'm going to go to transpose rotate. I'm going to click here where I want the center of rotation to be, and I'm going to drag out and let go somewhere off the model. Now the reason I do that is if I drag my line like this, it sticks to what's underneath, and I just want to make a clean straight line, so I let go over the background, and that makes a nice straight line. Now I'm going to move this transpose line into the center along where the spine would be. And I'm going to do rotate, R for rotate, and I'm going to click in the outer circle, and that will rotate around this circle. So wherever this circle is, if I click on the circle, I can move it. Click in this circle, and it will rotate based on, oops, missed a little bit of the masking here. I just want to make sure that I get the inner thigh mask there. Let's make sure all this is masked out. There we go. Go to transpose rotate. Click and drag the outer circle, and then we can rotate the body. And again, I need to make sure any stray areas that are not getting a mask have masking on them. So we've got to be careful with that. And let's do that again. Transpose rotate, and then click and drag. There we go. So that rotates the torso up. Now I want to rotate around the axis of the torso, so I'm going to click and drag in the center circle, and that will rotate the torso. Now, this is an interesting thing that we can do. Let's go ahead and control, click, and drag up the waist a little bit more. Let's extend that mask so it's going a little bit further up the waist. Oops. Let's do control, click, and drag. And just make sure we get a nice mask right up to the waist there. Control click to feather the mask, go back to rotate. I'm going to draw another transpose line, move it to the center of the spine, and then I'm going to pull the end out pretty far. Now I'm going to go to rotate. I'm going to hold down the Alt key while I twist to the center circle, and that sort of twists but limits the effect of the twist, so it creates a far more natural kind of rotation here. So that's a nice little trick there. Now notice that our subtools here are masked as well. So before I do that rotation, I need to make sure that I unmask those teeth and tongue. Now when I click and drag that center circle, they will rotate along with the head. So let's go ahead and let's arch the back a little bit more. Let's grab that circle, bring it back here, and just bring that back up a little bit. And then let's rotate the head. So I'm going to go to transpose rotate, mask down the neck based on the topology, invert that mask. You see the teeth and the tongue are unmasked. I'll draw a transpose line along the neck, and then let's just move it from the top view so it's sitting right down that axis. And then we can rotate that head and rotate it back. There we go. So you see that we're able to very, very effectively pose this character. Let's mask down to this arm here. Let's go in with our brush and just make sure that we manually mask out any areas that didn't quite get enough masking. And let's go ahead and control click to feather the mask and do a transpose line here. And then we can bring that arm out. And then I'll move this end point, go to rotate and click in that center circle, and that'll just rotate that arm out a little bit. Let's do the same thing for the other arm. We'll go to R for rotate, control click and drag until we get the topology of that arm masked. Sometimes it can be a little tricky depending on the underlying mesh. We may have to come in and manually unmask areas that we want to deform, like I'm doing here on the shoulder. Go to transpose rotate, draw a line here, and let's rotate this shoulder back. And now I'm going to rotate the elbow. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to draw the transpose line down to the elbow. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and then click and drag inside the center circle, and that does what's called bone posing, where it'll stretch what's on this side and compress what's on this side. So it actually helps give us a nice kind of a skinning deformation there. I want to supinate this arm so the palm is facing a different direction. So I'm going to draw a transpose line down the length of the arm, and I'm going to extend the end point out pretty far, go to rotate, hold the Alt key down, and click and drag the centermost circle, and that supinates the bones of the forearm. See that? Now we're going to have to manually fix those fingers because the pose doesn't work anymore for the fingers, but I am going to bend the wrist. So I'm going to draw a transpose line down to the wrist, hold down the Alt key, and then just click and drag to bend that wrist out. All right, so let's clear our mask. And we're going to come down here and let's do some posing on those fingers. So let's control, click, and drag to mask down to each finger and see if we can't fix these up a little bit. So I'm going to begin by Alt, make sure that I don't have extra fingers unmasked here. There we go. Rotate, Alt, click, and drag in the outermost circle. Go up to the next knuckle and Alt, click, and drag that down. And Alt, click, and drag this. The idea is that we just want to sort of get those fingers in a little bit more natural position for where the hands are now. They're no longer splayed out against the ground, so it doesn't make sense for them to be in that pose anymore. Control, click, and drag down to the ring finger, and then just draw another transpose line. And I just Alt, click, and drag in the outermost circle, and just repose those fingers. It's a little unwieldy. It's a little clunky when you first start doing it. I won't lie to you, but it does become quite simple as you become accustomed to the tool. It doesn't behave much like other tools, so it might feel a little bit difficult for you the first time you use it. So there you go. That hand feels a lot better now. I do want to do some adjustments though right there. We'll go to the move brush and just do some adjustments on the hand there. Do a little bit of smoothing. There we go. This looks like he's maybe caught sight of some sunlight up here, and it's very upsetting to him being a cave dweller. Let's fix these fingers on this other hand. Go to transpose and control, click and drag down to that first finger. Draw a transpose line, and then we will alt, click and drag to rotate those joints. Do the same thing for the middle finger. We've got to be really careful that we don't accidentally unmask portions. So there we go. Let's draw that transpose line. Move it inside the knuckle, and then just alt, click and drag to rotate that digit down. Alt, click and drag. Oops. Alt, click and drag to rotate. Extend that joint down to the next knuckle. Alt, click and drag to rotate that. We'll do the pinky finger now. Make sure that everybody gets a mask. Alt, click and drag. Make sure that nothing is unmasked. Alt, click and drag. Bring that joint down. Alt, click and drag. And there we go. So now we've got a much better pose on that hand. Now, perhaps I want to adjust one of the legs. I'll do transpose rotate and mask down to the leg. And then manually unmask the hip. We'll go to transpose rotate. We'll draw a line from the hip down to the knee, and we'll just rotate that leg back. And then we'll bring that joint down to the knee. Let's mask down to the knee. Bring the joint down here and hold down the Alt key and then click and drag, and that'll use that bone posing, that sort of stretch and compress algorithm to help make that deform nicer. And I get a little bit of collapsing there I want to fix, so I'm just going to manually take the move brush and tweak this stuff out a little bit. There we go. Let's take the inflate brush and just build up that calf muscle a little bit. And there we go. Now maybe we want to put a little bit of asymmetry into the tail. I will mask the tail up to the base of the spine, invert that mask, and then very, very simply do the same thing with Alt, click and drag, just scooching this joint down as I go. Alt, click and drag. And that executes that bone posing that's so very, very effective. Let's mask down to here, draw a transpose line, Alt, click and drag, just to whip that tail up a little bit. Alt, click and drag. There we go. Oops, that's too much. Go back here. Alt, click and drag. There we go. So now we've got our pose. How do we transfer this back to our model with the individual subtools? We go back to Transpose Master and click T-Pose to Sub-T. And that will take the position of each one of those subtools and transfer it over from that base mesh. So here we should see an update. There we go. And unfortunately, we got a little bit of a problem there. Let's come back over here. And it looks like at some point, my teeth didn't catch up with my head, my teeth and tongue. So what I will do is I will just mask the body. Very, very simple. Take a transpose line, and I'll just scooch these pieces over. That was my mistake, and it happens with some regularity when you get in the groove when you're sculpting or posing. That can happen, but it's easy to fix. I'll just scooch those over, clear the mask, and then T-pose to sub-T, and it will transfer all those positions over, and it should correct those teeth and tongue. There we go. Now if there's any sort of tweaks I want to make, I can come in here and just make sure that everything's still lining up nicely, which it does actually appear to be lining up pretty well to the underlying sculpture for the gums there, so that's all good. Now, that is transpose posing using Transpose Master and the transpose line. Now we do have another option here. We can pose using Z-spheres. Z-spheres can be used as a posing rig, and this is actually quite nice. And we're going to take a look at this now. And in addition to this, we're going to look at the ability to store our pose in layers. Now we can do this even if we're not using Z-spheres. If we turn on this layer option here, it'll take the pose and then add a layer for each subtool and store the pose in the layer. So let's take a look now at Z-sphere rig and layers. I'm going to open up a new file to do this. So here we have our creature once again with the various subtools, and we also have a Z-sphere rig, and this is just a Z-sphere chain that was built based on this character. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Transpose Master. I'm going to turn on Z-sphere rig and I'm going to turn on layers. Now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to select my Z-sphere rig and I'm going to click Store Transpose Master Rig. Now we'll go back to our character and I'm going to click T-pose mesh, and this will create a T-pose mesh like we did before, but this time there will be a Z-sphere in the center. Now I'm going to click Paste Transpose Master Rig, and that rig that I stored from my Z-sphere chain will update and paste inside of this character, as you see here. Now, you could just use that Z-sphere that was loaded up by default to build your rig right here inside of the model. I just found it easier to make one separately because I used a Z-sphere chain to create this model. What's important is that you just have that Z-sphere chain, and each sphere exerts a radius of control over the vertices around it. So you want to make sure that you have spheres enough to carry all the details of like the head or the joints and the fingers, etc. I didn't put joints down the fingers of this character because I just wanted to illustrate sort of a big generalized posing, but of course you could put spheres down through the hands. If you'd like to learn how to create hands with Z-spheres, I encourage you to watch the Z-sphere video that's part of this series. So we've got the Z-sphere chain inside. How do we pose with it? Well, what we do is we come down here to rigging and click bind mesh. Now the mesh is bound to my Z-sphere chain, and I can simply go to rotate, and I will rotate this joint. I can rotate this joint. Notice that my knee has two spheres in it. I find that that's much better for maintaining the volumes of the leg. So we'll bring that foot down a little bit. Let's go ahead and maybe grab this sphere here and let's rotate. There we go. We can rotate that torso up. Rotate that neck. There we go. Maybe we'll bring one arm out, bring this arm up, bring this arm back, and there we go. Let's actually adjust this wrist a little bit. There we go. So here we've created another pose. Now, what I will do is I will come back and click T-pose to sub-T just like we did before, but this time we have layers turned on, so watch what happens. One thing that's nice about this method of posing is you never end up leaving your other subtools behind because they just become part of the rig. You don't have to worry about manually unmasking anything that might have become masked. There we go. So that deformation transfers over. And here we go. So now you see that we've got our pose transferred over from our rigged version of the character. If we go to the layers menu, you see that there is a layer here. If I turn off visibility on that layer, the tongue returns to its original position. If I alt-click on the body to select the body, for example, go to our subtools, make sure the body is selected, go to our layers, turn off visibility on that layer, it returns the body to its original position. So that's quite handy. Being able to have layers in which each portion of your pose is stored means that you can always return to a neutral position, that you don't have to have that pose intact. You can always get back to the original model position, which is very, very nice. It's a handy thing to have. And again, that can be used even if you don't have Z-sphere rig turned on. Layer can be used even if you're just doing transpose posing. So that is Transpose Master and posing in ZBrush. Hopefully you found this useful and you can see ways that you can incorporate this into your own workflow. I used to not use Z-Sphere rigs myself. I was aware of the process because I had to teach them, but over the last year or so, I've started really utilizing them more and more. I think it's a really effective way of posing. It just takes, I think, a little bit more time because you need to go in there and create your rig, but it can be really nice for posing hands and doing complex compositions between multiple characters. So I encourage you to explore those options if you can. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. In this video, we're going to talk about Sculptor's Pro Mode. Sculptor's Pro Mode is found here at the top of the screen, and what this does is it changes the way in which our brushes interact with the surface of the model, freeing us from having to worry about subdivision levels or Dynamesh. Sculptor's Pro Mode basically introduces real-time tessellation, which is part of the program Sculptress, which is also available from Pixelogic. Now let's look at our mesh here. I've got a generic sphere. I'll go to geometry and delete my lower subdivision levels because Sculptor's Pro Mode requires just one subdivision level to work. Under the standard brush, if I draw a stroke, the stroke will perturb the points underneath the stroke to change the shape of the model. Now, if I turn on Sculptor's Pro Mode and make the same stroke, you'll see that it tessellates the mesh as it draws that stroke. It adds geometry so it can create the shape that I'm asking for and make it as smooth as possible. If I turn my draw size down even smaller, it makes more geometry. So what's happening here is tessellation, and if you've watched my video on Decimation Master, you'll know that tessellation is where a quad mesh is sliced up into triangles. Areas of low detail have fewer triangles, and areas of high detail have more and smaller triangles. Now ZBrush is smart enough in Sculptor's Pro Mode to see what type of shape you're trying to make. If you're working with a small draw size, it's going to make a finer stroke. A bigger draw size will make a bigger, less tessellated stroke. It will actually reduce polygons in those areas. So, how do we use this in practice? So as I'm working, if I take the Move brush, for example, I don't need to worry about Sculptress. It's not going to need to tessellate the mesh as I work. It's just going to shift and move things around. If I go to the Clay Tubes brush, Sculptor's Pro Mode does work for this particular brush, so as I'm sculpting, ZBrush is tessellating the mesh as I go. Now, Sculptor's Pro Mode is great for sketching because, like I said, it frees you from any sort of concerns about topology or about having to dynamesh your mesh. You don't have to stop at any one point and do control, click, and drag. It's just down to trying to create the form that you want to create. It's sort of ideal in that regard where you're just not worrying about the technical aspects of digital sculpting. You're just creating form. And that's really the ideal. That's what we're looking for as sculptors, I believe, is just being free from the tool. So all we need to do is sculpt. Now, as I'm working, if I press the Shift key, notice my brush turns orange. This is the smooth brush. If I smooth, you see that it slices up detail in areas that have low detail. If I turn my brush size down even smaller and smooth, it adds more geometry. If I turn my brush size up and smooth, then it decimates the area. Now, these controls for this brush are found under the Stroke menu. If I go to Stroke and tear this off, open Sculptor's Pro, make sure that we're on a brush with Sculptor's Pro turned on. There we are. We have Adaptive Size, Combined, Subdivide, and Undivide. Now, Adaptive Size, if I turn this off, then what that means is if I click and drag to draw a stroke and then create a bigger stroke, it's not going to subdivide that mesh depending on my brush size. If I take my subdivide size and turn this down, it will increase the subdivisions, but it'll be for every stroke size. The draw size will not control at all the level of tessellation. Now, if I turn off Combined, what this means is that let's turn it on and I'll show you what I mean. If I've got a small brush stroke here that's very, very tessellated, turn up my draw size and do a bigger stroke across it. Do you see how it decimates where it crosses the stroke? If I turn off Combined and do the same stroke, it will not decimate areas that are already detailed. So that's a way that if I've got an area of high detail, perhaps I've gone in, let's turn this back on and I'll create an area of high detail, like maybe I've created some kind of nose shape here and a mouth shape that I like. So we'll do little shapes here and here. All right, so I've got that, which has a lot of detail. Now maybe I want to take my standard brush, turn the draw size up, and I want to build up this area. By turning off combined, I can make these big broad brush strokes in this area, and it's not going to decimate any of the denser areas. It's just going to continue to tessellate areas that require it, and it's going to leave areas alone that do not need to be decimated. So let's turn combined back on. Now, with adaptive size turned off, we use our subdivide slider to control the tessellation of the mesh. Undivide controls the degree of decimation when the mesh is being reduced. This is a global setting. These control all of the brushes. However, we can customize individual brushes. I think that Sculptris Pro works really, really well for sculpting on meshes that are decimated and ready for 3D print, because I can go in and spot correct areas or detail areas without vastly increasing my polygon count. I also tend to use it a lot if I have to clean scan data, which is always triangulated and always a little noisy. So I can clean up noise using Sculptris Pro mode, because it's just using triangles by default, so it's a great way to work on scan data. But when I do either of those, I need to customize my brushes. So I'll take the brush menu and tear this off. And under the brushes, we have Sculptris Pro. Now here I've got an option to use global. If I turn that off, for the standard brush, it will no longer be using these controls. It will be using these controls. Turn that back on. If I press the Shift key, that's my smooth brush. If I turn this off, I am now using these settings for my smooth brush, not the global settings. Now remember the global settings for the smooth brush. If we smooth an area with a large draw size, it's going to decimate that mesh. However, if I turn off use global, then I can come down here and I can turn my subdivide size down, turn off adaptive size, turn my subdivide size down. And now my smooth brush will increase resolution at a big draw size. So I may very well want to do that when I'm working on scan data that doesn't have a lot of detail but has a lot of noise in a certain area. I can increase my resolution in that area and then go in and clean it up and smooth it without having to rely on this control here, which is going to reduce as I'm sculpting. If I have a large area that I want to smooth, if I do it like this, it's going to reduce the polygons in that area, which is not always what we want. So let's take a look at another tool here. Let's say we've got a model that we want to tessimate. So this is just a regular sphere sculpture. It's got multiple subdivision levels. If I step down, it just came out of a polysphere. We have the ability under the geometry menu now to tessimate. Now what tessimate does is it will triangulate and tessellate the mesh, turning it into triangles, and then that's a great way to start from an existing model using Sculptris Pro mode. So if I leave polygon size to 1 and click tessimate, it tells me I need to delete my lower subdivision levels, which I'll do. So here I have tessellated it, and you see that I've actually lost a bit of detail. So I'll undo that, and I'll turn my polygon size down, and then it will tessellate it again. Now this time I've retained my detail. If we zoom in, you see we've got some nice triangulated surface. Now I can turn off tessellate and just use decimate here. So if I were to decimate the surface, you see it starts to simplify areas where it feels like I can get away with it. If I turn my polygon count up, it will decimate, but still maintain as much detail as it can, given the request for the polygon size I put in there. Now there's some brushes that are designed to work with Sculptris Pro mode. If I go to B for brush, S for snake, and grab snake sphere, for example, the snake sphere brush is a great brush for this. If you click and drag, it draws out these tubes. And we don't have to fuss around with curved brushes or curve mode. It's just simply clicking and dragging, similar to the snake hook brush, which it's actually based on. If I hold down the Alt key, I can actually push these in. If I turn my Z intensity down, there we go. It's behaving a little bit strange. Let me turn my Z intensity up a little bit higher than that. There we go. It's a little bit easier, I find, to work with because it can be really, really strong with the maximum Z intensity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this to create some horns on this character. So I'll click and drag, and this is sort of dependent on brush pressure. So if I taper off my brush pressure, I can taper off the horn. But that's not really that necessary because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the smooth control here and I'm going to smooth this mesh down. So let's go to smooth. Let's go back to our settings up here and make sure that everything is set as normal. And go to frame mode and let's turn our subdivide size up to 0.7. There we go. And I'm going to smooth these horns. Take the move brush, pull that out a little bit, turn my draw size up, and I'm going to sort of simplify the area down here at the base. Take the inflate brush and inflate the base here. Let me turn up my Z intensity. There we go. Do a little bit of smoothing there. And then I'll take my damn standard brush. And with the damn standard brush, I'll start to create some details here. Let's turn off frame mode so we can actually see it, where that horn is growing out of the surface. And that's created just using the snake sphere brush. Take my standard brush and then I can sculpt in between those wrinkles just to make it feel like these are raised bits of skin around that horn base. And then we'll take our smooth brush and soften that area and reduce some of the polygon count there. Now for the horn itself, maybe I want to increase the resolution on the horn now, so I'll turn my draw size down and I'll smooth that area like so. Remember also that I can turn off adaptive size and then I can just smooth like this, and that will increase the polygon count there. There we go. Now, if I go to my standard brush and grab, say, Alpha 58, I can use Alpha 58 to create these sort of fine alpha details on the surface. And it's still tessellating. It's still in Sculptris Pro mode. It's just allowing me to spot apply this fine, fine detail just in this area where I need it. Elsewhere, where I don't need that level of detail, it doesn't have that level of tessellation. If I turn off my X symmetry, I can come through here and I can add wrinkles through the brow like this, and it's only going to tessellate those areas where I'm using that alpha. As you can see, it's only adding that detail in the mesh where I need it. So turn my brush size down, go to frame mode, and let's set this back up to here. We can smooth that back a bit. There we go. So Sculptris Pro is an extremely powerful way of sketching in ZBrush. I think it's a unique way of working because, like I said before many times, it frees you from having to worry about any sort of mesh considerations. All we're doing is just sculpting form. And I think that's quite a bit of fun. I like working this way. Again, though, I treat it as a sketching tool. I start a model with it, but I wouldn't necessarily finish a model with it. I would get something started and then turn it into either a Dynamesh or a subdivision model. Just like I say in the Dynamesh chapter, I don't tend to take Dynamesh through to the end of a sculpture. I will use Dynamesh to start something, and then I will bounce it into a subdivision model, which is a process that I show in depth in that chapter. So I hope you found this video helpful and informative, and you can go forward now and start using Sculptris Pro in your own workflow. I think it's a wonderful way to open up a sphere and just do a lunchtime sketch at work, or anytime you just want to start noodling around in ZBrush, give it a go and see how it works for you. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. In this video, we're going to look at a new tool in ZBrush 2020. It's under the Polygrouping menu, and it's Polygroup from Polypaint and Polygroup from Masking. So here we've got this alien character where I've created some sort of tribal tattoo markings using the Deco brush. What I'll do is I will come here to From Polypaint, and I'm going to turn the slider, the tolerance, up so I get more polygroups based on my Polypaint. So I'll click From Polypaint, and that's going to start polygrouping based on the underlying Polypaint. So we'll give it some time to think about that. Because we have these large sweeping blocks of indigo, that should polygroup separately as a selection that we can then isolate. There we go. If we go into frame mode here, you can see we get quite a few groups now, but if I Control-Shift-Click, I can isolate just those bits there. Now, I want to further refine this, so I'm going to hold down the Alt key and I'm going to click from Polypaint again. There we go. You see that further refines those polygroups, so I can hide the pinks and all the others here, all these other groups, or I can just make everyone visible again and then just isolate those. So it's still just a little bit, no, actually I think we mostly got it. No, I think we could do a little bit more because we've got these little hanging bits here that we don't want. So Alt-click from Polypaint, and then that further refines things. Let's Control-Shift-Click on that polygroup again. There we go. Now if we look here, turn off frame mode, some of the purples here are quite close to that indigo, so it's causing us to catch extra groups there, which I'm not really keen on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use, under Polypaint, Adjust Colors. And I'm going to do a little selection here just for these bits here, and I will make this color very, very, very divergent from the underlying purples and greens. Let's just make that super crazy saturated and intense. Click OK. There we go. Now that should polygroup with far more clarity compared to the other portions. Let's go ahead and clear our mask and go back to polygroup. And let's set our poly tolerance, let's set that to 0.5 and go into frame mode and do from Polypaint. There we go. I'll Control-Shift-Click on these bits here, and now we get a much, much nicer selection. Now I could further refine this and keep adding polygroups. If I hold down the Alt key when I click from Polypaint, what that will do is it will additively change the polygroup, so I can continue to refine that down. But we hit a nice point here. So what I can do with this is I can mask this, make everything visible again, and then I could use that masking here to make an extraction. So let's go to Subtool, Extract. We've set our thickness to 0.005. Let's go ahead and click Extract. And we should be able to create an extraction based upon those tribal markings. I like those, so we'll click Accept. There we go. Now I'd like to clean up the edges of them, so what I'll do is I'll go to the Deformation menu, go to Polish by Features and turn this on, and then just turn that slider up, and you see what that does is it just cleans up all the little nuances and weirdness maybe. We can also do Polish by Groups. Again, we'll turn that on. That just makes it a stronger effect, and we can polish by polygrouping. Let's make these metal. Go to RGB, color, excuse me, let's change this to white. Go to mRGB, color, fill object. Go back to our subtools and turn on visibility on that head. So then we get these interesting kind of metallic accoutrements that line up right against the character that are based on those underlying Polypaint elements. Now I can also do this with masking. Let's go ahead and select the head again and hide those pieces. Sometimes masking can be a little bit easier, especially if we don't want to do any sort of color hue shifting. Like if I wanted to keep that indigo, like so, if it was very important to me not to change that color, what I would do in this case is I would go to the masking menu. Under masking, I would go to mask by color and then mask by polypaint. And this opens up a similar control to what I had before when I was adjusting color. I'll just click and drag and select the indigo. If I invert the mask, you can see that it's sitting right perfectly on top of that of those markings. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK, and then that gives me a mask on those markings. So if I go to Polypaint and turn off Colorize, you can actually see, let's go back to our basic material 2, you can see where those masks sit. So now I can go to Polygroup, and I will just group by masking. Now it's set to 0.0001. I will go ahead and set this to 0.5, and then from masking. And there we go. If we go into frame mode, you can see we get a very, very clean poly grouping based exactly where we had that masking. So those are two very, very powerful tools that are available to us in ZBrush 2020. If I were to, for example, mask these out, I could then take my inflate brush, turn down my Z intensity, and just sort of add a real interesting kind of raised scarification to this. So there's all sorts of interesting things that we can do here. I could also use, for example, let's raise all of this and then smooth all of that. I could then use maybe the surface controls. If I go to Tool and open up Surface Noise and then edit our noise, we could add noise just to these scarification areas. So let's say, for example, I turn up the strength of the noise, adjust the scale of it. I could go into my noise plug and go to my trusted Veroni. I quite like the look of Veroni. We'll turn Mix Basic Noise down and turn our noise scale, or excuse me, our plugin scale down. Turn our strength up. And then click OK, and then we can get this very, very interesting Veroni scaling texture all over that, that scarification area. So that's another potential use for this tool. So hopefully you found this useful. That is under the polygrouping menu that is new in ZBrush 2020, and that is polygrouping from Polypaint and from masking. So let's take a look at the history brush. It's another new brush in ZBrush 2020. And what this allows us to do is blend out or erase or clone various history states. So to begin with, I've got some history on this character right now. And there's another new tool that I'd like to show you. If we go to the Edit menu, we can actually truncate our history. I can step back with my undo counter to previous versions, and then I can delete the history before that or delete the history above it. I want to delete everything that came before the point that I'm at now. So I'll go to Edit, I'll turn my undo counter all the way up to the top, so that's my last undo, and I'm going to delete older history. So we're starting fresh. It's very, very nice to be able to use this, especially if you're going to be using the history brush, because you can accumulate quite a bit of history, and it can be a little bit hard to navigate it if you've got thousands of history states up there. So this allows us to get rid of maybe the very beginnings of the sculpture that you really don't need, and focus in on those undos that matter the most. So here we've got our character, and let's start to add some details to the skin. So I'm going to go ahead and mask out this little bit here. I'm going to use the noise maker, like I've done in a couple of the other tutorials, to create sort of an interesting skin texture just on the top of the head here. There we go. And I'll step down a couple subdivision levels, invert the mask, and then feather it so we get a nice feathered edge on it. Then we'll step back up to the highest subdivision level. And I'll go to Surface, Noise. Let's orient the character so we can see it in the noise window here. The navigation, of course, is just like ZBrush. Go to the noise plugin and do Veroni. Veroni, I think, makes a really nice kind of bumpy skin texture. We'll turn Mix Basic Noise down to 0. We'll turn the strength up until we can actually see it. And then we'll turn the scale down until we get a nice sort of bumpy, scaly skin texture there. So I'll click OK. Now, we always want to make sure that the strength is a little bit more than we think we need, because when we bake this down into the mesh, it often loses some of its fidelity. So I'm going to turn the strength up just a little bit higher than I think I need. There we go, and now I'll click Apply to Mesh, and that'll bake that noise down into the sculpture so it becomes part of the actual detail of the model. There we go. Now we can clear the mask. Now, let's say I want to go back and blend out the history state before we had that, that bumpy detail. So what I can do is I'll just go back in my undos to before we added that. I need to make sure that I'm at my highest subdivision level on that undo state. There we go. I will first off, I'll go to B for brush, H for history, and select the history recall brush. Now I'm going to control click on this history state, and you see it turns white. Now we'll go back to the last history state. You see there's our stored history state there. If I take my brush and I start to blend out, oops, I have to turn off symmetry mode. That's one nuance of this brush that you have to be aware of. It's also works best if you're sort of looking straight down at the area that you want to blend out. So there we go. You can see that I can very softly blend out this detail. I'll turn down my Z intensity on the brush so it's not quite so strong. And this is a really great way of taking an area of high detail and then blending it out into another area, which is always a little bit tricky. You know, when you're working with alphas and detailing a mesh, sometimes you can find yourself having some trouble trying to transition one area of detail into another, and this makes it really easy to do that. I can use it as an eraser by simply turning up my intensity to 100%, and I can completely restore that history state, just like that. You see, it's effectively an eraser in that case. There we go. Now, of course, I can turn down my Z intensity, and I can turn down my focal shift, and really use it as a subtle blender. So that's really my favorite way of using this brush. And it's nice too because it frees me up to go in and really push and experiment with details, knowing that I can blend them off quite easily later. So for example, if I go to my clay tubes brush and select alpha 58, I'll control click on that alpha undo state. Let's control click on it. That deselects it. Now we'll go back to our last state here. And with the clay tubes brush with alpha 58, this allows us to create these really nice raised wrinkles like you see here. I'll turn my Z intensity down, and we'll just run a few of these along the cheeks here. So I really like this brush because it creates these wrinkles that very naturally go from high point to high point. So you end up stretching the sort of wrinkly skin in between the high points of the folds of the face. Let's do another one here, through here. Through here. And I don't even have to smooth this back because what I'm going to do is use the history brush to blend it off. And that's very, very nice because smoothing is a little destructive, but the history brush is just sort of like turning down the volume on this detail. There we go. Maybe run some through here and run some through here. Now I'm going to go back in my undos to before we put that detail on. There we go. Perfect. Control click on this undo state, then go to our last undo state. Now I'll go to my B for brush, H for history, and select the history recall brush. It's B for brush, H for history. Now we'll turn our Z intensity down, and here you can see this is just like a blender, just a soft blender. I can knock back this detail, and I can just keep building up my brush stroke in the areas that I want to really fade it out to nothing, because it is cumulative each time I run the brush stroke across it. So we'll knock back this detail here and through here. So watch this area. We're just going to go ahead and turn down the volume, as it were, on this detail through this area. Now, this history recall brush is a wonderful way of blending out detail. I'd like to show you another method that you can use for this, just so you have another tool in your arsenal, and that is storing a morph target and using the morph brush. So if I go to the morph target menu here and store a morph targets are just a copy of the mesh in memory. So if I make a big change here using the move brush and come back here and switch, I can switch between those two versions of my mesh, the stored morph target and the altered mesh. Now you can only have one morph target at a time. So if I store a morph target here, and then if I were to go in and, let's say, we'll take the standard brush with the spray stroke and dot alpha, and let's use this to create some kind of a detail on the surface. Now if I go to B for brush, M for morph, we have a morph brush here. You can see the hotkey is O. Turn my Z intensity down, and this does effectively the same thing. It's just blending off to that stored morph target. So the benefit of the history brush is that you have the access to all of your stored history. So you can go back to any undo state and blend out the model to that point. The morph target and the morph brush is very, very nice because it's very fast. You don't have to store an undo state. And I'll use this a lot before I put down an area of real heavy detail, knowing that I'm going to want to blend it off with the previous state. And there we go. And once again, this can be used as an eraser by just turning it up to 100%, and that will erase that detail out completely. So that is the history recall brush, as well as the morph brush. It is a wonderful way of taking your model and restoring and mixing states from any part of your undo history. It's a wonderful blending brush. It's a wonderful sort of hacking brush. So you don't have to feel like you can't get back or you can't, once one particular stroke is set in stone, you can always go back, store an undo history, and then blend that off. So I find it really, really liberating and really valuable as a brush in the tool set. I've been using it quite a bit in conjunction with my morph brush technique as well, and it's made the whole detailing process in ZBrush all the more powerful. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next lesson. Now I'd like to talk to you about the Deco brush. The Deco brush is new in ZBrush 2020, but it's based on a brush that's been inside of ZBrush since the beginning. It was one of the original 2.5D brushes. If we go into the tool menu here and come down here to 2.5D, you'll find the Deco brush. This is the original Deco brush. We don't use this one anymore. But what the Deco brush did was create this really nice sort of cursive or calligraphy type stroke. So what has been created now, if we go to B for brush, D for Deco, we have the Deco Curve Dot and Deco Curve Drag brushes. Now these are really nice for creating really interesting types of shapes. So what I'll do is I'll select the Deco Curve Drag, and here you see we've got an alpha with an arrow and a drag dot stroke. So if we draw on the surface of the model, we create this curve. Now, of course, we can do the same changes as usual by clicking on the curve and adjusting it. And when we do, we see that that stroke appears, and we can move that stroke around the surface. And if we zoom in, you can see that that stroke is essentially that arrow alpha stretched all along the length of that curve. If I come over here, extend this curve, and then drag, we can actually extend that stroke. So let's take a look at this in action with a different alpha. What I like to do is customize this brush. Let me undo back to the beginning. I'll go to the Dam Standard brush, and I quite like the alpha for this brush. So I'll go to Alpha, Transfer, and I'm just going to click Make Modified Alpha, and that will just make that alpha available to me in the brush, in the alpha palette. Now we'll go back to the Deco Curve Drag brush, and oops, B for brush, D for Deco, Deco Curve Drag, and we'll change that alpha to the alpha that we just extracted from the Dam Standard brush. Now I'm going to turn on RGB and turn off Z-Add, and I'm going to select a color here. So let's use this to create some color variation on the surface, some kind of tribal markings or tattoos. So I'm going to create some curves here. And then if I click and drag, you see the effect that we get. We get this really nice calligraphy stroke that follows that curve. Let's do another one here. Let's create some nice sort of streak markings here. Let's turn our draw size down. Do another kind of zigzag here. And then pull that curve. You can see the effect that we get. These types of strokes are otherwise hard to get, actually, and I really enjoy sort of the process of making these. I like the effect that they have. Like that's really quite a nice stroke there. Let's undo that and do it again. I'm just going to click and drag that, and there we go. We get this really nice kind of elegant line. Now I can drag this all over the surface and determine where I actually want to drop this stroke, which is another quite interesting thing, is this stroke travels along the surface until I exit my curve. Once you drop the curve, it's gone. You can't pick it up again. You have to draw a new curve. So let's draw another one through here, and let's do some markings down here on the chin. There we go. There we go. So you see how very easy it is to build up these very unique strokes on the surface. Now, if I go back to B for brush, D for deco, we also have deco curve dot. So let's change that to the same brush alpha and go to RGB. And you can see the effect that this has. This one doesn't drag along the surface, it continues the stroke. So I'm not migrating my stroke so much as, whoops, let's undo that and let's go to the neck here where it's easier to see. So if I drag this here, there you go. You see that it leaves the stroke behind and continues it rather than sort of migrating the stroke along the surface. Whereas the drag curve dot allows me to do this and move that stroke until I let go of the brush. Let's turn our draw size up and we'll create some strokes here. Come around to the back, turn our draw size up again, and create some interesting strokes here. Now we can change our alpha to anything that we want. Just some alphas lend themselves better than others to being dragged along that stroke. Typically it's the fine point alphas and the directional alphas. I find the arrow to be quite obviously an arrow. So I typically don't use that one, but you get the idea. If you create a directional alpha, you can get some real interesting effects with this. Now we can use it for more than just painting. We can use this also for sculpting. So if I switch over to this shirt, I find this to be a really good brush in its default settings. So let's go ahead and reset current brush. Let's change to brush alpha 1. And we're on Z add, so I'll change it to Z sub. And let's say we want to create some compression folds here. So what I'll do is let's turn off Z add, or let's turn off X symmetry. So I'll create these sort of characteristic zigzag folds that you get where fabric sort of bunches up. And we drag, we get this really nice effect here. Let's drag another one right next to it. And I'll hold down the Alt key and that will raise that. So this is just really perfectly designed for creating folds and wrinkles. Let's turn our draw size down and let's draw another one just along here. Hold down the Alt key so it raises. So you see that's the effect that we get. If we change our alpha maybe to alpha 1 and then let's do another zigzag here. You see we get a different effect. I'm going to turn down my draw size and then drag this again. There you go. And then let's drag next to it. I'll draw a new stroke running along the top because whenever I'm sculpting drapery, let's undo that and hold down the Alt key so it adds. I always try and do a positive stroke for every negative stroke. So do an add for every subtract and vice versa. So there we go. If you just, let's go back to the deco curve drag, and I just tap over here, anywhere on the model, it gets rid of those curves. And then I can maybe step down subdivision levels, do a little bit of smoothing on this, but it's just a really nice way of building up the compression wrinkles, those characteristic folds that we get in fabric. So I'll come in with the standard brush here and just continue to nuance that. There you go. So I think probably my favorite thing to do with this brush is to use it on fabric and drapery because it just creates the perfect sort of gathered folds. So that is the deco brush. The deco brush can be used in painting, it can be used in sculpting, and it's quite a bit of fun. And if you haven't used the Deco brush before in its previous incarnations, I encourage you to give it a try because it creates these really, really interesting shapes that I think you'll really enjoy exploring. And again, just because I was using it on fabric doesn't mean that we can't go in here and use it as a sculpting tool for wrinkles on skin. So here we go on Z sub. If we were to create a little, let's do a little wrinkle right here on the forehead and then click and drag, and see we can very, very easily build up. That's a bit too deep, so I'm going to turn my Z intensity down on that. We can very easily start to build up like forehead wrinkles and different forms like that. That's quite nice. Let's turn up our Z intensity a little bit more. There you go. So you can see it's a really nice way of building up folds and wrinkles either in skin or in fabric. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. In this video, we're going to talk about two new options that are available in ZBrush 2020, and that is under Polypaint. If we go to the Polypaint menu under the Tool menu, you'll see we have the ability to colorize by draft and by thickness. Now these are very important when you're doing 3D printing. We'll start by looking at from thickness. When we have an object like this bust here and we want to 3D print it, first of all we need to establish the scale, the object size. Now once the object size is set, we need to make sure that parts of the object are not too thin to actually be printed. So for example, here in the ears, very often we find the ears can end up being too thin. So an object that's maybe 6 inches tall, the thickness of that ear will be too thin for some printers to build accurately. So previously, there hasn't been a way in ZBrush to check and see what your thickness would be over the course of your model. When you would have to send it to the 3D Print Bureau, and then their software, when they loaded it onto the tray, would say if there was a problem. Or if you're printing with a company like Shapeways.com, their online tools will show you there's a problem in this area or this area. Now we're able to do this directly in ZBrush and fix any potential problem areas right out of the gate. So the first thing we need to do is set our object scale because obviously the thickness is dependent on the overall object scale. We'll do that by going to Z plugin and going to Scale Master. And I'm going to click sliders to subtool size, and this will update the sliders to what the actual scale is of the object. Right now this is like 0.5 inches tall. Now I don't want that. I want this 3D print to be, let's just make it, let's say 8 inches high from bottom to top. Now I will click Resize Subtool, and it's going to tell me that resizing all the subtools based on the selected dimensions will create an XYZ value larger than 100. So it just needs to unify and then rescale. That's totally fine. Click OK, and it will cycle through all the subtools, and it will scale them in relation to each other. So the current selected subtool, the head, will be scaled to 8 inches tall, and then all the other subtools, the eyes, for example, those will also be scaled to match that ratio. So they will be scaled up so they're still sitting in their accurate relative positions. So now you see we have an 8-inch tall model. Now I have the holes filled in this. This is a watertight mesh, which is necessary for 3D printing. Now what I want to do is I want to create a Polypaint map or Polypaint layer here that will show me where areas are potentially too thin. To do that, we just go to Polypaint, and I will click From Thickness. Now we have min and max sliders here, and these are just fine at their default settings. What this is going to do, it's going to create a color range, and that color range is defined under Preferences, Analysis. Under Thickness, you can see this is our color range. Red is too thin, and then blue is ideal. So we're hoping to see things between blue and green, and we want to avoid things between yellow and red. So let's go ahead and do this now. I'm going to click From Thickness, and it's going to start calculating. So this could take a little bit of time depending on how dense your model is or how complex it is. So we're just going to give this a moment to process, and when it's completed, we'll come back and take a look at the resulting map. And here we see the resulting map. Any areas that are blue or green are going to be just fine. It's the areas in red that we're most concerned with. So if we zoom in here, you can see that these areas are usually where areas are kind of perhaps a little bit thin, like the eyelid here, or these wrinkles along the underside of the eyelid, the tissuey wrinkles here. Now, in my experience, these tend not to be that much of a problem as long as you don't have a lot of depth underneath them. It's these areas where it's basically a single mesh thickness that's protruding out. So if we were to hide the eyeball, you could see that that's just a protrusion in that eyelid. So what we'll do here is we'll just take the Move brush, and then very simply, we can just increase the thickness in this area. So I'm just going to use this to pull those eyelids back a little bit, take the standard brush, and build out the front of the eyelid. So by having this guide, this color-coded guide, we can see very, very clearly the areas that are potentially a problem. And then just go in and make some subtle tweaks to them. Now, just because its coding is red here doesn't necessarily mean these areas will be a problem. You may find that these print just fine. When you supply them to your print bureau, they may see that it's not going to be an issue. It's nice because it gives you an opportunity to go in and judge these areas on your own and see any place that you may have missed. Because, for example, those eyelids, I hadn't quite caught that I had that degree of draft behind there. So this is very, very helpful to be able to have a visual guide where I can see exactly where that might be a problem and then go in and correct it. Here at the wings of the nostrils, this is a potential issue right here. That's a little bit thin. I might just take the inflate brush and just do a tiny little bit of inflate there, and just that little bit of thickness in most cases is enough to take care of that issue. And I'm not terribly worried about these little bits down here that we're getting in between pores and wrinkles. Those are not an issue. The most important parts are these continuous red areas like we see on the nostrils and the eyelids. So let's see, let's do a little bit of inflate here on the ear. And we'll do a little bit of inflate here and here. And now we will do from thickness again, and we can see the changes that we've made will update the resulting color-coded map. So let's go ahead and click from thickness again. And here we see the resulting map. We have an improvement now around the eye area and the ears. And as I said, anything that's just sort of these little spatterings of red, I don't worry too much about. It's only when we have a large region of red or yellow, that's when I'm concerned and I want to go in and manually check that specific portion of the mesh. So that is from thickness, and that is very important for when we're doing 3D printing. Now, we also have a new option here called from draft, and this is when we're creating an object that we're going to make a mold from, or if we're trying to 3D print a mold itself. Draft is any area that curves back on itself. For example, here around the cheekbones, the mesh curves back on itself. So if we were to create a mold, so we could make a casting of this, let's say if the mold split right here, anything to the right of this is the pull direction of the mold. So anything that's curving under like that is going to lock into the mold. So that's potentially a problem. So when we're trying to create, for example, an object that's going to maybe be injection molded with plastic, that's a solid object in a solid mold, we want to be very careful with our draft angles and our pull direction. So just like with from thickness, I'm going to orient the mesh on screen and then click from draft, and it will once again process and then give us a color-coded map showing us the draft angles. So let's do that now. Let's click from draft, and I will pause the video while it processes this and then return once it's back. And here we go. Here you can see if we have a mold from here, all the areas of red are areas that are going to potentially lock inside the mold. The areas in green are going to pull accurately. So this allows us to see exactly where the mold parting line should be and areas that we might need to fill in. Just like we had to thicken areas that were red from thickness, here we would need to go in perhaps with the clay tubes brush and just correct this draft. So we would just fill in these areas so they no longer curve back. Now, this is really only something that you need to be concerned with if you're creating an object that's going to be a solid that's being pulled from a solid mold. Flexible molds like silicone molds and urethane molds, that's not as much of an issue. But anytime we're doing injection molded plastic, knowing your draft angles is very, very important. So this is extremely useful for those people that are interested in that type of manufacturing. Now, once again, I would go in, make my corrections, and then calculate from draft one more time. So let's just go ahead and fill this out a little bit more, and you'll see how this updates. I'll just take the move brush and pull that out a little bit. Orient my model on screen once again, and then click from draft. And there you see that draft on the cheekbones is now gone. Now I do have the option to set my direction here. I can set my pull direction, or I can invert the pull direction. So if I change to the side view here, for example, and then click set pull direction, and then do from draft once again, it will update that pull direction so it's coming from the side. Typically, we create the mold looking straight down the z-axis, but that's not necessarily always the case. It's something that is posed or asymmetrical. So now when we turn, you see there we have our new pull direction. This wouldn't be ideal because your seam line would be running straight down the face. So typically we're working from a view like this. Let's set the direction again, where the mold's on the sides. And there we have it. So these are two really important and helpful tools for anyone that's doing 3D printing, for manufacturing, for jewelry. Anytime that you're doing any type of 3D printing, it's very, very important to have total control over your thickness and your pull, your draft angles when you're doing molds. So these two tools are a fantastic new addition to ZBrush 2020, and hopefully you'll find them useful as you go forward and do more 3D printing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Now let's take a look at a Z plugin called Z-Color. Z-Color is found under the Z plugin menu here. It's the last item, and if you unroll it and then click Z-Color, it will load up the Z-Color interface. Now you may notice that I don't have my ZBrush maximized right now. That is because the Z-Color menu, unlike other ZBrush menus, will float above your workspace. So I could potentially bring this over to a second monitor and have it docked off screen, or I can keep it floating over my workspace as I paint. And that's extremely valuable because other ZBrush menus are docking on the left or right, or they will take over the active screen and you have to Alt-Tab back to ZBrush. Z-Color is designed so it floats, so you have constant access to it while you're working as you would a proper color palette. Now, Z-Color is giving us the ability to have a very robust color selection tool. Previously, if we wanted to work with color in ZBrush, we would be working with the color wheel here. Maybe we would go to color and open up the modifier submenu, and there we've got a few other variations on color selection. Some of us would create a background image and then have our color swatches painted on there, and then we would just click and drag from this color swatch to pick up any color off the screen. Notice if you hold the Alt key, that will differentiate between the shaded pixel and the raw pixel color. Personally, I would often, as I was painting a character, I would just paint my colors onto the back. So I just had a little section of color swatch there so I could always go back and select my base colors again. None of these were ideal solutions, and what Z-Color introduces for us is the ability to save out color palettes and have them always accessible, and even save them to disk to open them later to use on another painting. So let's take a look at how this works. The interface opens up like this, and on the left-hand side you see a selection of swatches. Now these particular swatches are named with their hexadecimal values. On the right-hand side we have our color selection and our assigned color. So if I were to click on a color here, you see my color selection changes. Now here, if I click these two little arrows, this will open up a subpalette where we have HSV and RGB sliders to adjust the color value. And down here you see we have a color wheel that shows our exact selection. And then most interestingly, we have this selection of swatches on the right-hand side. Now these are color systems. We've got an analogous color scheme. We have the shades here. We have monochromatic, complementary, triadic, and then split complementary. Now these come from color theory. If you're not familiar with these, I highly recommend taking an afternoon, getting on YouTube and watching some videos on color theory, because this is very helpful when you're painting. When we want to paint a prop or a character or a costume, it's really good to have an established color palette. So here, with my selected color, this gives me the analogous color scheme. And what that means is those are the colors that are left and right along the color wheel. They are the analogous colors. Next, we have the shades. Now that's just moving this dot up and down. It's the relative lightness and darkness of that one specific color selection. Next, we have monochromatic, and that's simply that color fading out towards white. It's just monochromatic, it's one color. Next, we have complementary. Now, that is our color plus the complement. So here I've got the color selection and the complement on the opposite side. So the complementary color is always that color that sits on the exact opposite of the color wheel. Triadic is a color scheme that's created by superimposing a triangle over your color selection. So here I've got the orange, I have the greens and the purples. So that's the triadic color scheme. And then lastly, we have split complementary, which is the complement and the color selection. So it's basically and splitting off to a third color. So it's basically two primaries and a secondary. Um, Having a set color scheme, I can't stress enough how much guesswork that takes out of your painting process. If you're just putting down color until it looks right, which is a valid way of painting, sometimes I paint that way, that's one thing. However, if you have a set color language, then you know, well, I'm going to be selecting the analogous colors for this, or I'm going to be selecting the split complementary. And it just keeps your color language unified and making sense on the color wheel. So let's switch over to the light box and let's open up a polysphere just to make things a little bit easier to see. Let's focus in on that and let's change our color to white. Now, as we're set up right now, you see that we've got two little buttons here. This first button, if we mouse over it so we get the tooltip, let me click in that interface so it's active. This is direct mode. If I select this and then select a color, you'll see that it updates on my sphere. The sphere doesn't have a color filled on it yet, so as I select these colors, they become the color that's on the sphere. So if I want to select this orange and then click Set Color, that sets my color selection. And then if I click Fill, select that color, it will fill the object with whatever color I have selected. So that is now filled. So if I turn that off and then I change my color selection, it's not going to actually change the color that I have on the object. So if I select this orange and click Set Color, and then switch to this and Set Color, you see that it's setting my current color selection. If I turn off direct mode and then select color, I can compare my currently selected color. So when I'm setting color, I'm setting my active swatch. Watch what happens down here. If I change my color, nothing happens. If I click Set Color, that sets my color selection. So the reason for these two swatches is to allow you to compare and contrast between your current selection and what you're clicking on. So currently I have this color set. If I go to my standard brush, change to RGB and turn off Z Add, I am now painting, oops, turn on RGB, I am now painting with that color selection. If I scroll down and let's say switch to a different color, click Set Color, that is now my color selection. So I'm now painting with this color. So let's take a look at how we can update these swatches on the left-hand side. This is my color library. So if I click File New and say No, that clears those swatches. Now, down here, anytime I selected a color, these color schemes would update. If I wanted to keep these color schemes, I could lock them. So let's go ahead and load up a new color selection. I will go to File, and then I will click Open. Now, this will take me to the Applications ZBrush 2020 folder, ZPlug or ZStartup, ZPlug64, Color Data, Swatches. So basically, let me show you that in the browser window. Here you go. You see we've got our, here it is down here. We've got Applications. On Windows, this would just be your ZBrush 2020 install folder. ZStartup, ZPlug64, ZColorData 2020, swatches, and here we have our swatches. Now there's two types of files in here. There's a ZCO file and an ACO. ACO is an Adobe Color file, and we'll get to that in a moment. We're interested in the ZCO files here, so if we do ZColor sample colors and click Open, that opens these colors, and you'll notice these are named with actual color names. These are not given hexadecimal values. So if I want to find everything purple, I can start typing purple, and that will give me all of my purples. If I want all the oranges, I can do OR, and that gives me forest green and Z orange, because OR is a string that's in both of those names. I could also just scroll down these. So let's say I like the sage green. Notice when I click it, it makes that my color selection, but it's not my assigned color. down here, it gives me updated swatches for that particular color scheme. So if I select this, those will update. If I select this, those will update. If I lock these, you see that those do not change when I change my color selection. If I set color, I have now set that sky blue, and that is my color that I'm painting with. So let's clear these swatches again. I'll go to File, New. That clears the swatches. Now I can create my own selections. If I right-click on the analogous color scheme, I can add row to swatches. Now notice, this has been renamed. It's AN 1 through 5. That tells me this is an analogous color scheme, values 1 through 5. If I come down here, right-click and add row to swatches for split complementary, I get SP 1 through 5. So this just helps me put together a few of these color schemes, and it names them clearly so I know what I have selected. Now, my favorite thing that we can do with the ZColor plugin is loading up our own Adobe color file. So let's click New, say No, and go to File, Import. Now these are Adobe color swatches. So if I go to, let's say, let's do Visibone. Here we have a selection of colors and values that were stored in that Adobe color file. Now what's most interesting is we can make our own Adobe color files. I'm going to click New, clear that out. And then I'm going to go to color.adobe.com, the website, and let's switch over to that now. Close out of ZColor. There we go. So this is color.adobe.com. Now, if you don't have a account here, go set one up, because this allows you to explore color, learn new ways of thinking about color, and creating your own theme. So here we have a color wheel where you can just directly select color by moving these swatches around. This is analogous. I can do monochromatic. You see this very, very clearly shows you how these sit on the color wheel. There's the triadic that I was telling you about, which is a triangle superimposed on the color wheel. Split complementary, we've got these two colors and then the complement. So that's sort of a Y shape superimposed over the color wheel. Now as I move out this way, it's more saturated. As I move in this way, it's desaturated. There we go. If I go to, let's say, shades, here I get my single color selection, but it gives me relative lightness and darkness of that color. Now, if I go to extract theme, this is fantastic. This allows you to bring any image into the website and it will extract a color language from it. So if I click select a file, I have this image of a mummy head. Now I can move these bits around to make selections. Maybe I don't want the background so much as I want the various hues of brown and gray that are in the face here. So I can move these and this will start to give me actual selections off of this image. Now I can do I can extract by using mood. These can be useful. Usually I have it set to none, but I can focus on the darks, I can focus on the deeps, muted colors, which would be desaturated, the brighter values, colorful. Let's go back to none, and then we'll just reset these back where they were. So here we've got a selection of colors sampled off this mummy. Now I can tag them here however I want, and then I can set the name, and we're just going to call this new mummy head. And then I click Save. Now what this does is it saves this into my swatches. So if I go to My Themes, open up my Maddie folder here, here's all these different color swatches that I've saved. I've got one from a Seurat painting. I have a few from a mummy. I've got a moray eel who I selected color off of. I have a cool version, a couple mummies, lip gloss color theme, coral color theme. So here's my new mummy head. Now here I've got a download button. If I click download, that will download that as one of those Adobe color files. So now we can go back to ZBrush. Let's open ZColor again. Now I'm going to go to File, Import, and I'm going to import that file that I just downloaded from Adobe. So we go to File, Import. We'll say no. And I'm just going to go to my folder where I have saved that particular file. And here I've got Mummy Head ASC. There we go. There are our swatches. So I can select those. I can delete the swatch if I right-click on it, or I can select it. Now, if I unlock my swatches down here, I can further refine this down by breaking out individual color selections into other palettes. So maybe I want to grab this one, add that row to swatches. So here I can continue to sort of expand out my potential color selections, and I've got them right here in the Z color interface. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on set color, and now I will be painting with that brown. Or maybe I want to select this as a base tone and fill the object, so we'll select that. There we go, that fills the object. And now I can make other selections, say for example, there we go, set color, and I'm painting again. There we go. So you can see it's very, very, very easy with Z Color to have access to a unified color palette and very easily go in and select colors and then assign them to your brush or to your model. So if you have the opportunity, I highly recommend exploring the Adobe Color site, bringing in some custom-made palettes, and having a go at painting some characters. I think if you're painting an alien, it's a great idea to grab some images of sea life and then use those images to extract a color palette, and then try and apply that same color palette to your alien character. So I hope you found this helpful. This is one of my favorite ZBrush plugins. It's probably the most useful for a lot of what I do, because when I'm painting, I always want to be able to have the most robust tool set for selecting color. And this is the best thing to happen to color in ZBrush since the color wheel. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson. Now let's take a look at something new in ZBrush 2020, and these are the extractor brushes. The extractor brushes allow us to take a model which has an area of detail that we like, say for instance this bumpy skin texture on the back of this alien's head. We can extract this, both the sculptural detail and the RGB color, and then we can apply that elsewhere as an alpha with a brush. So let's take a look at how we can do that now. We're just going to snap to a side view, and we want to capture this area of detail here. If I press B for brush, X for extractor, you see we have three extractor brushes. There's the freehand extractor, extractor drag dot, and extractor drag rectangle. We'll start with the freehand extractor. Go to the alpha menu, and here you have a From Brush button. This generates an alpha from a brush stroke, and you see the hotkey for that is G. So this only works with the extractor brushes. So while I'm in an extractor brush, I press G. Now my brush turns blue, and that just lets me know that this option is now turned on, and I can change my alpha width and my blur seam, which for this I will leave as they are. Now what I will do is I'll turn my draw size up, and I will click and drag. And I'm just stroking along the area I want to capture, and you see it gives us this capture here along with the RGB color. So now we'll switch over to our ogre, and let's zoom into the side of the head here, and leaving the extractor brush activated, I will click and drag, and what this does is it adds both the sculptural detail as well as the poly paint. So it's trying to tile that texture extraction along the head. If I go to Subtool and turn Poly Paint off and turn RGB off on my brush, we can see this just as the sculptural components. So I can come in here and I can start to add that extracted detail. Now this is a projection brush, so it works best if you're looking straight down the axis that you want to apply this detail to. Let's turn my draw size down a little bit, and I can actually scale this texture down as we get closer to the front of the head. Turn it down. Oops, that was the masking brush. Turn it down once again, and we can create quite a fine little bumpy texture as we're coming down here into the forehead. Always remember rotating so we're kind of looking in the direction that we want to apply this detail. Let's rotate around to the front. Here we go. And I'm just stroking along, transferring that detail right onto this new model. So this is a fantastic way. If you've taken the time and effort to put an interesting texture on one Z tool, you can repurpose that onto another Z tool with a minimum of effort. You can just capture it and then reapply it. There we go. Now let's try one of the other brushes. Let's go back to our alien. Now that was the freehand version. Let's zoom in here. And let's do the drag rectangle version. So I do B for brush, X for extractor, and do extractor drag rectangle. Press the G key and then click and drag, and that grabs whatever region I select. So you see up here at the top of the screen, it's going to start generating. I think it might have actually just done that already. Let's do that. Let me turn that alpha off and then just extract again just to make sure it's actually grabbing it. There we go. It just grabbed it very, very quickly. So here we have extracted color as well as texture detail. Now, if we come back to our ogre, go to another area here on the back of the neck, and we're still in the extractor brush, click and drag, and it will add this. Let me turn my focal shift down so it's got a harder edge on there. I can then apply this as a texture stamp. Maybe I want to scale this up a little bit. Let's turn the draw size up, focal shift down, and then we can just really scale this up and give a really big bumpy texture to the back here. And again, if I were to turn color back on, you see it is applying the color material or the color as well. So we can use this as both a painting brush and a sculpting brush. So I'm going to turn the RGB off so we can see it a little bit clearer. And come over here to the other side and go back to our alien. Now let's say I want to grab this area here. I'll do B for brush, X for extractor, and this time let's extract drag dot, or extractor dot. Press the G key, click and drag, and you see it's just extracted this area. Now this is a drag dot, meaning that if I come back over to our ogre, it's applying this as a drag dot stroke. I can turn my draw size up, my focal shift down, and if you look, I'm dragging and positioning this, and it's sort of projecting onto the surface until I let go. So I can reposition these as I move. So let's do one more. Let's go back to our alien. And let's do B for brush, X for extractor, and let's grab this extractor brush here, press the G key, and I'm just going to drag a strip across the forehead like that. And you see what it's done is it's grabbed a strip of forehead. So we come back to our ogre, and let's go back to the beginning of the undo history. So we have a clean forehead here. Let's turn that poly paint off. And if you watch, if I click and drag, it will add those wrinkles that we just extracted. And I can put them in either direction. I can run them up the forehead or across the forehead. If we move down here to the neck, we could even repurpose these wrinkles into the neck area, just stroking along just like this. So any type of detail that you fancy, that you've created on your model, you can extract and then apply to a different mesh. And this is a very, very handy brush. It's, I think, one of my favorite things in ZBrush 2020. It also has another functionality that's similar to the history recall brush, where you can store an undo state to compare against. So when we're doing our extractions right now, sometimes you capture, if you look at this alpha here, we're capturing some of the big shape forms underneath. Perhaps we're in a situation where we don't want to do that. For example, I have a digital scan of a hand, which has a lot of nice knuckle detail. I want to capture just the mid-frequency and high-resolution details of the knuckle and apply it to another model. So I'll show you how we do that now. So here we have a digital scan of a hand. Now this has been processed to be a Z tool. It actually has a Z remesh or base mesh with multiple subdivision levels going up to level 7. So we'll let that update and you can see the details that we've got. Now what I want to do is I want to capture the wrinkles in these fingers and transfer them to another model. So I've got, a hand in progress over here for a creature, and I'd like to put some knuckle wrinkles on there. So I've got this scan, and I say, well, I'd like to actually extract this from the scan. Now, the extractor brushes allow you to not only extract detail from a mesh, as we've already seen, it allows you to set an undo state and then compare the mesh between the undo state that's stored and the current state where you're extracting the brush from. Now, what that means is instead of generating the displacement map, as it were, from level 1 all the way up to your highest subdivision level, it's allowing you to say, well, I only want you to capture the mid-frequency and high-frequency details. It's much like generating a displacement map from level 5 of 7 rather than level 1 of 7. So I'll show you what I mean. What I want to do first off is actually smooth out this detail so I can get all of my get all of the detail isolated in the subsequent undo history. So what I need to do is go to morph target first and foremost, make sure I'm at the highest subdivision level and store a morph target. Now I'm just going to step down a couple subdivision levels and start smoothing the details on this knuckle here. Now I'm going to go to my smooth brush, go to the brush menu, go to modifiers, and I'm going to press the shift key and take brush modifier and turn it down to -100. And what that does is it forces the smooth brush to only smooth the high frequency details and retain the low frequency. We'll step back up 2 subdivision levels. And we'll do the same here. I just want to smooth away all this high frequency detail. Let's step down 1 subdivision level. Smooth all this back. Step up a subdivision level. Now there should be much less detail to deal with. There we go. I'll go back to brush and restore my brush modifier to 0. That's just my standard smoothing brush. And we'll smooth that out a bit. So we've now effectively removed all the details from this mesh. Now I'm going to go to morph target and click switch. So you see my undo history here. When I switch back to my stored morph target, give that a moment, it adds an undo state. So what I can do now is I can step back 1 undo state where I'm at the highest subdivision level, but there is no detail. I'm going to go to B for brush, X for extractor, and select, let's do extractor drag rectangle. Now I'm going to control click on this undo state to store it. Now that undo state is stored in memory. I'm going to step back up to this undo state, and I'm going to press the G key, and I'm going to extract now. And what it's going to do, it's going to extract the difference between this state and this state. So let's click and drag, like so. And that should capture that detail. So it's going to have to do some map extraction. And there is no color information on this mesh, so we're only going to get the alpha right there. Now the alpha is set to 128 by 128. I can go to my alpha menu, turn on from brush, and I can turn this all the way up to 1024. Let's zoom in here. And then I can do that extraction again. Oops, I just added. Click OK. Undo that. I can do that extraction again with a much higher resolution. So let's go ahead and give it a go first. I'm going to switch over to another model here. Here we've got our cave dweller creature. So I've got these hands in progress that I'd like to add more detail to. So let's zoom into those. And I'm just going to turn on solo so it's a little more reactive. Now I've got my extractor brush with my alpha. My alpha intensity, Z intensity is automatically set. I want to go in here and start applying those knuckle wrinkles. So if I click and drag, you see what we get is we get those knuckle wrinkles directly applied to these knuckles. So I'm able to very quickly go in here and start transferring sculptural detail from one model to another. So obviously I don't want everybody to have the same knuckle, but this is a really good example here, how we're able to get that nice detail in there. I might take the standard brush now with alpha 1, and I think I've said a few times through these lessons, anytime I do a subtractive sculptural stroke, I always try and do a little additive stroke next to it. that just helps give it form, gives it the buckling of flesh. You don't have to overdo it, just give it a little bit of volume, just like that. There we go. Just makes a big difference. So those are the extractor brushes. Hopefully you found this video helpful and it helps illustrate how you can use these brushes to extract details from one mesh to then apply them to another. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson.